Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight, before the story begins, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are right now? Take a moment, let the world slow down, and when you're ready, allow yourself to drift into the flow of tonight's story. The city breathed differently after midnight. Street lamps cast their amber glow across empty sidewalks where earlier the day's rush had pounded concrete into submission. Now in these quiet hours, the pavement seemed to exhale stories it had absorbed throughout decades of footsteps, conversations, and secrets whispered in doorways that most people hurried past without a second glance. In the old quarter, where brick buildings stood shoulder to shoulder like silent sentinels, the municipal police archive occupied 3 floors of what had once been a textile warehouse. The building's red brick facade bore the weathered patina of countless seasons, each winter's frost and summer's heat leaving their mark in tiny cracks that spiderwebbed across the mortar. During daylight hours, few people noticed this building tucked between a shuttered bakery and a newsstand that still sold papers despite the digital age that swirled around it like an unstoppable tide. But at night, when the city's pulse slowed to a gentle rhythm, the archive building seemed to come alive with its own quiet energy. Not the bustling activity of day workers and researchers, but something deeper, more contemplative. The weight of accumulated years pressed down through the floors, story layered upon story, case file resting atop case file, creating a sedimentary record of human complexity that stretched back over a century. The night security guard, a man named Fletcher, who had walked these halls for nearly 2 decades, understood this building's nocturnal personality better than anyone. His footsteps echoed softly against polished linoleum as he made his rounds, keys jingling with a rhythm so familiar it had become part of the building's nighttime symphony. Fletcher had developed a habit of walking slowly, not from laziness but from respect for the stories that surrounded him on all sides. Each filing cabinet, each banker's box, each manila folder contained fragments of lives that had intersected with the law in ways both dramatic and mundane. The basement level housed the oldest records, cases that predated computerized systems and modern investigative techniques. Down here, the air carried the scent of aged paper and that particular mustiness that accompanies documents that have absorbed decades of human handling. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a pale, steady glow that transformed shadows into soft gray pools in corners where filing cabinets didn't quite meet. Walls. Fletcher often began his evening rounds in the basement, working his way upward through the building's 3 floors of accumulated history. Tonight, as he descended the concrete stairs, his hand trailing along the metal banister worn smooth by countless hands, he found himself thinking about the passage of time and how it accumulated in places like this. Each step down felt like moving backward through years, deeper into the city's collective memory. The basement's main corridor stretched the length of the building, lined on both sides with floor-to-ceiling metal shelving units that held thousands of case files. The shelving system had been installed in the 1970s, replacing an older wooden filing system that had been deemed a fire hazard. But traces of the original system remained visible if you knew where to look. Scuff marks on the concrete floor where heavy wooden cabinets had once sat, nail holes in the walls where wooden supports had been anchored, small details that spoke of continuity and change occurring side by side. Fletcher paused at a section marked 1920 to 1929. And ran his fingers along the spine of a particularly thick folder. The cardboard had softened with age. Its original manila color faded to something more like cream, and the type label had grown faint enough that you had to look closely to make out the case number. Inside this folder, he knew, were the handwritten reports and typed summaries that documented someone's encounter with the law nearly a century ago. The paper would be brittle now, the ink faded to brown, but the words would still be there, waiting for someone curious enough to read them. The filing system itself told a story of evolving bureaucracy and changing times. The oldest files were organized by date and case number, their contents secured with metal fasteners that had rusted slightly over the decades. As you moved through the years, you could trace the gradual systematization of police work, the introduction of standardized forms, the shift from handwritten to typed reports, the eventual adoption of carbon paper for duplicates, and finally the early computer printouts that marked the beginning of the digital age. But tonight, surrounded by these physical records, the digital world seemed very far away. Here, in the basement of the police archive, time moved at the pace of turning pages and the soft whisper of paper against paper. Fletcher continued his slow walk through the corridor, his flashlight beam occasionally catching details that the overhead lights missed. A dog-eared corner on a case file, a coffee stain on a folder tab, a handwritten note in the margin of an official form. Evidence of the human hands that had processed these documents over the years. The section labeled Unsolved Cases occupied an entire wall of shelving near the building's rear corner, where a small window at ground level allowed thin slices of streetlight to filter down into the basement space. These files had a different quality than the closed cases, a kind of restless energy that seemed to emanate from their incomplete stories. Fletcher had often wondered about the people whose cases remained open, their questions unanswered, their situations unresolved despite years or decades of investigation and paperwork. He pulled down a file from 1955, its contents secured with a rubber band that had lost most of its elasticity. The folder contained the usual assortment of forms, incident reports, witness statements, evidence logs, follow-up notes. But what distinguished unsolved cases was their lack of finality. Instead of concluding with an arrest report or case closure summary, these files simply stopped, their last entries often noting that leads had been exhausted or that witnesses had become unavailable for further questioning. The 1955 case involved a series of break-ins in the warehouse district, a pattern of crimes that had puzzled investigators for months before the incidents simply ceased. The perpetrator was never caught, the stolen goods never recovered, and the case gradually faded from active investigation to cold case to historical curiosity. Now, 7 decades later, the file served mainly as a record of police procedures from an earlier era. Its practical value long since expired, but its historical significance still intact. Fletcher replaced the file and continued walking, his presence the only human activity in a space that seemed to pulse with the accumulated energy of countless stories. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed their constant electric song, occasionally flickering just enough to create brief changes in the quality of light and shadow. In these moments, the basement seemed to shift and breathe, as if the building itself were dreaming about the events documented in its files. Near the center of the basement, a large table served as a workspace for researchers and investigators who occasionally needed to examine multiple files simultaneously. The table's surface bore the marks of decades of use, rim stains from coffee cups, small scratches from papers, clips, and staples, slight depressions where people had pressed down hard while writing. Tonight, the table was empty except for a single file folder that someone had left behind, its contents partially visible in the steady fluorescent. Light. Fletcher approached the table and gently closed the abandoned file, noting its case number and the neat handwriting that had labeled it. The file appeared to be from the 1960s, part of a series of investigations into financial irregularities at local businesses. He made a mental note to mention it to the day staff, but for now, the file could rest undisturbed on the table, another small piece of the city's history, waiting for someone to continue reading its story. The heating system kicked on with a gentle whoosh of air, and Fletcher felt the subtle change in air pressure that accompanied the building's nighttime climate control. The archive maintained careful temperature and humidity levels to preserve its paper records, and the HVAC system worked continuously to create optimal conditions for document storage. The soft sound of moving air added another layer to the basement's quiet symphony, a reminder that even in these still hours, systems worked steadily to protect the accumulated knowledge stored in these filing cabinets. Fletcher's route through the basement followed a pattern he had established over years of night shifts, a methodical progression that ensured he checked every corridor and corner, while allowing him time to absorb the unique atmosphere of each section. In the area dedicated to traffic incidents, files documented decades of automobile accidents, parking violations, and the gradual evolution of traffic laws as the city grew and changed. These cases rarely involved dramatic crimes or mysterious circumstances, but they painted a detailed picture of daily life and the small conflicts that arose when people and vehicles shared limited space. The property crime section told different stories, tales of missing items and disputed ownership that reflected the city's economic ups and downs over the decades. During prosperous times, the theft reports involved items of value, jewelry, electronics, artwork, suggesting a population with assets worth stealing. During leaner periods, the reports documented the theft of more basic necessities, revealing the underlying economic pressures that sometimes drove people to desperate acts. As Fletcher moved through each section, he found himself thinking about the relationship between individual stories and collective history. Each case file represented someone's personal crisis or conflict, a moment when their private life intersected with public law enforcement. But taken together, these files formed a larger narrative about the city itself, its growth and change, its struggles and achievements, its ongoing effort to balance individual freedom with collective order. Violent crime section occupied a separate corridor, its files organized with particular care given the sensitivity of their contents. Here, Fletcher's pace slowed even further, his respect for the gravity of these cases evident in his careful movements and thoughtful expression. These files contained the darkest chapters of the city's story, events that had shattered families and altered lives in permanent ways. Yet even these difficult cases served an important purpose, providing documentation that helped the legal system process trauma and seek justice on behalf of those who had suffered harm. Fletcher paused at a filing cabinet labeled 1940 to 1949 and considered the historical context these dates represented. The files from this period reflected a city dealing with the social and economic upheaval of World War II and its aftermath, a time when traditional social structures were shifting and new challenges were emerging. The cases from these years often involved conflicts between different groups of people as the city's population changed and grew, documenting the growing pains that accompanied urban development. The wartime cases had their own particular character, reflecting the unique pressures and opportunities that conflict created on the home front. Some files documented crimes of opportunity, situations where the absence of men at war or the disruption of normal social patterns created conditions for illegal activity. Other cases involved the black market trading that developed around rationed goods, a reminder that even legitimate government policies could create unexpected consequences and enforcement challenges. Fletcher continued walking, his flashlight occasionally illuminating details that caught his attention. A photograph clipped to the inside of a file folder, a handwritten note in the margin of a typed report, a newspaper clipping that someone had included as background information. These small personal touches reminded him that behind every official document was a human being trying to do their job, to make sense of events, to serve their community's need for safety and order. The juvenile cases occupied their own section, files that documented the city's long struggle to balance punishment with rehabilitation when dealing with young offenders. These cases often had a different tone than adult criminal files, reflecting society's recognition that young people deserved different treatment and had greater potential for positive change. Reading through these files over the years, Fletcher had observed how approaches to juvenile justice had evolved, moving from purely punitive responses toward more nuanced strategies that took into account the developmental needs of young people. Near the back wall of the basement, a section labeled Administrative Records contained files that documented the internal workings of the police department itself. These records told the story of an institution adapting to changing times and circumstances, expanding from a small force that dealt mainly with local disturbances to a complex organization capable of handling the sophisticated challenges of modern urban life. Personnel files, budget records, policy changes, equipment upgrades, all the mundane details that made effective law enforcement possible. Fletcher's rounds took him past filing cabinets that contained records of disciplinary actions, commendations, training programs, and organizational restructuring. These files might seem less dramatic than criminal cases, but they were equally important for understanding how the police department had developed its capacity to serve the community. The evolution visible in these administrative records paralleled broader changes in professional law enforcement, reflecting the gradual adoption of scientific methods, psychological understanding, and community-oriented approaches to public safety. The basement also housed a small collection of physical evidence that had been retained for historical purposes, items too old to be relevant to active cases, but too significant to be discarded entirely. These artifacts occupied a series of locked cabinets near the building's rear wall, their contents carefully cataloged and preserved as examples of investigative techniques and criminal activity from earlier eras. Fletcher's security clearance allowed him access to these cabinets, though he rarely had reason to examine their contents during his routine rounds. Tonight, however, he found himself curious about one particular cabinet that contained evidence from cases in the 1930s. The cabinet's metal surface had developed a slight patina over the decades, and its locks showed the wear patterns that came from regular use by investigators and researchers. Fletcher opened the cabinet and examined its carefully organized contents: envelopes containing fingerprint cards, small boxes holding physical evidence, photograph albums documenting crime scenes, all preserved in the controlled environment that prevented deterioration. One envelope contained fingerprint cards from a counterfeiting case that had occupied investigators for nearly 2 years in the mid-1930s. The cards were examples of early fingerprint technology, their images captured using techniques that seemed primitive compared to modern methods, but which represented cutting-edge investigative science for their time. The fingerprints themselves were still clearly visible, their distinctive patterns unchanged by the passage of decades, a reminder that some aspects of criminal investigation remained constant even as technology evolved. Fletcher carefully returned the fingerprint cards to their envelope and closed the evidence cabinet, his movements reflecting the respect he felt for these historical artifacts. Even though these items no longer served any practical investigative purpose, they remained important as documentation of the police department's evolution and the COVFAS city's ongoing effort to maintain public safety through professional law enforcement. As he completed his circuit of the basement, Fletcher found himself reflecting on the relationship between individual cases and the larger patterns they revealed when viewed collectively. Each file represented a unique situation, a specific set of circumstances that had brought someone into contact with the legal system. But when examined together, these cases revealed broader themes about human nature, social change, economic pressure, and the ongoing challenge of maintaining order in a complex urban environment. The basement's clock showed that Fletcher's first round was complete, and it was time to move upward to the building's first floor, where more recent cases awaited his attention. But before leaving, he took a moment to appreciate the unique atmosphere of this underground archive. The way it seemed to hold the city's memory in its climate-controlled air and carefully organized filing systems. The stairs leading up from the basement creaked slightly under Fletcher's weight, a familiar sound that marked the transition from the archive's oldest records to its more recent holdings. As he climbed, he left behind the handwritten reports and carbon paper duplicates of the basement for the typed documents and early computer printouts that characterized the first floor's collection. The first floor housed cases from the 1950s through the 1980s, decades that had seen dramatic changes in both criminal activity and investigative techniques. Here, the filing cabinets were newer, their metal surfaces still showing traces of their original color beneath the accumulated dust and wear of decades of use. The fluorescent lighting was brighter on this floor, and the corridors were wider, reflecting more modern building standards that had been applied during renovations in the 1970s. Fletcher's routine on the first floor followed the same methodical pattern he used in the basement, but the character of the records here was noticeably different. The cases from this period reflected a city that was growing rapidly, dealing with new types of crime as social and economic conditions changed. Drug-related offenses became more common as illegal substances became more widely available. White-collar crimes increased as business and financial transactions became more complex. Technological crimes began to appear as new devices created new opportunities for illegal activity. The organization of first-floor files reflected these changing patterns, with specialized sections for different types of crime and more sophisticated cross-referencing, systems that helped investigators identify connections between related cases. The paperwork itself was more standardized, following departmental procedures that had been refined over decades of experience and professional development. Fletcher paused at a section devoted to organized crime investigations, cases that had required extensive surveillance and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. These files were thicker than typical cases, their contents documenting months or years of investigation into complex criminal enterprises. Reading through these files over the years, Fletcher had gained appreciation for the patience and skill required to build cases against sophisticated criminal organizations that took elaborate precautions to avoid detection. Organized crime files also illustrated the interconnected nature of criminal activity, showing how individual crimes often connected to larger patterns of illegal behavior that crossed jurisdictional boundaries and involved multiple participants. These cases required investigators to think systematically about criminal enterprises as businesses, understanding their structure, methods, and vulnerabilities in order to build effective cases that could withstand legal challenge. Near the center of the first floor, a conference room had been converted into additional file storage, its walls lined with filing cabinets that held cases requiring special security measures. Access to this room was restricted to authorized personnel, and Fletcher's security rounds included checking that the room remained properly secured during overnight hours. Through the room's small window, he could see filing cabinets that contained sensitive cases, their contents protected by multiple layers of security protocols. Sensitive files represented cases that involved ongoing investigations, protected witnesses, or information that could compromise public safety if it became widely available. These files required special handling procedures and could only be accessed by investigators with specific authorization and legitimate need for the information they contained. Even years or decades after the original investigations had concluded, many of these files remained restricted due to their potential impact on individuals or ongoing legal proceedings. Fletcher's route through the first floor took him past sections devoted to fraud investigations, cases that reflected the increasing complexity of financial crimes as business practices became more sophisticated. These files documented everything from simple check forgery to elaborate investment schemes that had defrauded victims of substantial sums of money. The evolution visible in these cases showed how criminals had adapted to new technologies and business practices, finding ways to exploit vulnerabilities in financial systems that were themselves constantly evolving. The fraud cases also illustrated the challenge of investigating crimes that often involved multiple jurisdictions and required expertise in complex financial matters. As business and financial transactions became more sophisticated, law enforcement had to develop new skills and techniques to effectively investigate and prosecute economic crimes. The files from this period documented not only individual cases but also the police department's efforts to build expertise in financial investigation and develop relationships with other agencies and professional organizations. In the section devoted to property crimes, Fletcher could observe changes in both criminal methods and investigative techniques over the decades represented on the first floor. Cases from the 1950s often involved straightforward burglary and theft, crimes that were investigated using traditional methods of interviewing witnesses and examining physical evidence. But as time progressed, both criminals and investigators became more sophisticated, leading to an ongoing arms race between criminal innovation and law enforcement adaptation. The property crime files also reflected broader social and economic changes that influenced criminal activity. During periods of economic growth, property crimes often involved items of increasing value: television sets, stereo equipment, later computers, and other electronic devices. During economic downturns, the pattern shifted toward crimes motivated by basic necessity, reflecting the economic pressures that sometimes drove people to illegal activity as a survival strategy. Fletcher's examination of the first floor files often led him to consider the relationship between crime and social change, the way criminal activity both reflected and responded to broader developments in society. The cases from the 1960s and 1970s, for example, showed clear connections to the social upheaval and cultural changes of those decades. Civil rights protests, anti-war demonstrations, and countercultural movements all generated their own types of legal cases, many of which fell into gray areas, where the distinction between legal protest and illegal activity was not always clear. The drug-related cases from this period told a particularly complex story about changing social attitudes and legal responses to substance abuse. Early files from the 1950s and 1960s often treated drug use as a criminal matter requiring punishment and deterrence. But as understanding of addiction evolved and treatment options became available, later cases showed a gradual shift toward approaches that balanced law enforcement with public health concerns. Fletcher found the drug cases particularly interesting because they illustrated so clearly how legal and social approaches to complex problems could change over time. The files documented not just individual cases, but also broader policy debates about the most effective ways to address substance abuse and its associated criminal activity. These debates continued to evolve, with each decade bringing new perspectives and approaches based on accumulated experience and changing social attitudes. The first floor also contained files related to juvenile cases from the 1950s through 1980s, documenting how approaches to young offenders had evolved during these decades. The earlier files showed a system focused primarily on punishment and deterrence, reflecting social attitudes that treated juvenile crime as a smaller version of adult criminal behavior. But gradually, the files revealed increasing recognition that young people required different approaches that took into account their developmental needs and potential for rehabilitation. The juvenile files were often more hopeful in tone than adult criminal cases, reflecting society's investment in the possibility that young people could learn from their mistakes and redirect their lives in positive directions. Many of these files documented successful interventions that had helped young offenders avoid further contact with the criminal justice system, providing evidence that rehabilitation-focused approaches could be effective when properly implemented. Fletcher's security rounds on the FAZUM first floor included checking a small research area where investigators and academics occasionally worked with archived cases for professional purposes. The research area contained tables and chairs, basic office equipment, and access to reference materials that helped users understand the historical context of older cases. During daytime hours, this space sometimes hosted graduate students working on criminal justice research or investigators examining cold cases for potential new leads. Tonight, the research area was empty except for a few files that someone had left on one of the tables, evidence of ongoing work that would resume during regular business hours. Fletcher made note of the file's location and case numbers. Standard procedure to ensure that valuable documents didn't become misplaced or accidentally mixed in with other materials. The files appeared to relate to a series of burglaries from the 1970s, cases that shared certain characteristics that might suggest common perpetrators or methods. The cold case investigations represented one of the most intriguing aspects of Fletcher's nighttime observations. These files contained cases that had never been solved, despite extensive investigation, their questions remaining open decades after the original crimes had occurred. Advances in investigative techniques, particularly DNA analysis and computer databases, had made it possible to re-examine old cases with new tools, sometimes leading to breakthroughs in cases that had been dormant for years. Fletcher had observed several cold cases during his tenure that had eventually been solved through new investigative approaches or the emergence of new evidence. These successes provided encouragement that even the oldest unsolved cases might eventually yield their secrets, given sufficient time and the right combination of investigative skill and technological capability. As Fletcher completed his first-floor rounds, he took a moment to appreciate the different character this level had compared to the basement archive. Where the basement felt heavy with accumulated history, the first floor had a more dynamic quality, as if the cases it contained were still somehow active, still capable of generating new developments and insights. This difference reflected the nature of the cases themselves. While basement files were primarily historical documents, first-floor cases were recent enough to remain relevant to current investigations and legal proceedings. The second floor awaited Fletcher's attention, housing the most recent cases and the administrative offices where archive staff worked during regular business hours. This floor represented the most active part of the building, where new cases were processed and researchers accessed information needed for ongoing investigations. The transition from first floor to second floor marked a movement from historical archive to working law enforcement resource, from memory to active investigation. Fletcher climbed the stairs to the second floor, his keys jingling softly as he prepared to examine the building's most contemporary holdings. Here, the cases would be more recent, their documentation more detailed, their potential for new developments still very much alive. The second floor contained the archive's connection to the present day, its interface with the ongoing work of law enforcement and criminal justice. Second floor buzzed with a different energy even during the quiet overnight hours, a sense that this space remained closely connected to the active work of investigation and justice. Fletcher's rounds here would complete his circuit of the building, bringing him full circle from the historical depths of the basement to the contemporary concerns of current law enforcement, from the city's memory to its ongoing efforts to maintain safety and order for its citizens. Asterisk. The second floor held a different kind of silence, one that spoke not of forgotten history, but of active documentation and ongoing process. Here, the fluorescent lights seemed brighter, the air moved with more purpose through modern ventilation systems, and the filing cabinets bore labels written in contemporary fonts, rather than the faded typewriter text that characterized lower floors. Fletcher's footsteps echoed differently on this level, where polished linoleum had been replaced by commercial carpeting that muffled sound and created an atmosphere more suited to concentrated work than historical contemplation. Detective Sarah Brennan's desk occupied a corner position near the building's eastern windows, where morning light would eventually filter through Venetian blinds to illuminate the careful stacks of case files that covered nearly every available surface. Tonight, those files rested in the gentle glow of security lighting, their manila folders and typed reports waiting for tomorrow's attention. Fletcher's security rounds brought him past this desk several times each night, and over the years he had developed a quiet appreciation for the organized chaos that characterized a working detective's workspace. The files on Detective Brennan's desk represented active investigations, Cases that demanded daily attention and careful documentation of every lead, interview, and piece of evidence. Unlike the historical records stored in the building's lower levels, these files grew thicker with each passing day as investigators added new reports, witness statements, laboratory results, and follow-up notes. The constant accumulation of paperwork reflected the methodical nature of modern police work, where every action required documentation and every piece of evidence demanded careful handling and chain of custody. Records. Fletcher paused near the detective's desk and observed the careful organization that governed the arrangement of active cases. Files were grouped by investigation type, priority level, and current status, creating a visual system that allowed Detective Brennan to track multiple complex cases simultaneously. Color-coded folders distinguished between different types of crimes, while small flags marked files that required immediate attention or contained time-sensitive information. One particular file, thicker than the others and secured with an additional rubber band, bore a case number from earlier that year and a handwritten note indicating it involved multiple jurisdictions and ongoing federal cooperation. Fletcher had noticed this file growing steadily thicker over recent weeks, a sign that the investigation it documented was generating substantial activity and requiring extensive coordination between different law enforcement agencies. The federal cooperation aspect intrigued Fletcher, representing a level of complexity that distinguished modern police work from the simpler cases documented in the building's historical archives. Contemporary crime often crossed jurisdictional boundaries, requiring investigators to coordinate with agencies at local, state, and federal levels. This coordination generated additional paperwork and procedural requirements that made modern case files substantially more complex than their historical counterparts. Adjacent to Detective Brennan's workspace, a bulletin board displayed photographs, maps, and timeline charts related to current investigations. The visual displays represented an attempt to organize complex information in ways that revealed patterns and connections that might not be immediately apparent when examining individual pieces of evidence in isolation. Red string connected various photographs and documents, creating a web of relationships that told a story about criminal activity and investigative progress. Fletcher examined the bulletin board displays during his nightly rounds, observing how they evolved as investigations progressed and new information became available. Photographs were added or repositioned, timeline entries were updated with new dates and developments, and maps were marked with additional locations as investigators expanded their understanding of criminal activity patterns. The bulletin boards served as visual representations of the investigative process, showing how complex cases gradually revealed their secrets through patient accumulation and analysis of evidence. Maps displayed on the bulletin boards showed the geographic scope of modern criminal investigations, with colored pins marking locations where crimes had occurred, witnesses had been interviewed, or evidence had been collected. These maps revealed patterns that might not be apparent when examining individual incidents in isolation, helping investigators understand how criminal activity moved through the urban landscape and identify potential targets or areas of concern. One map showed a series of commercial burglaries that had occurred over a 6-month period, with red pins marking the locations of each incident. The pattern that emerged suggested a systematic approach to target selection, with criminals focusing on specific types of businesses in particular neighborhoods. This geographic analysis had helped investigators predict likely future targets and allocate patrol resources more effectively to prevent additional crimes. Fletcher's route through the second floor took him past several workstations where different detectives specialized in particular types of crime. Each workspace reflected its occupants' investigative focus through the materials and resources they kept readily available. The fraud investigator's desk contained reference books about financial regulations and business law, while the narcotics specialist's workspace featured maps of known drug distribution patterns and contact Information for informants and treatment programs. The specialization evident in these workspaces reflected the increasing complexity of modern criminal activity and the corresponding need for investigators to develop expertise in particular areas of law enforcement. Unlike earlier eras when police officers were expected to handle any type of case that came their way, contemporary practice recognized that effective investigation of complex crimes required specialized knowledge and training. Detective Martinez's workspace focused on domestic violence cases, files that required particularly sensitive handling due to their impact on victims and families. These cases often involved ongoing situations that required continuous monitoring and coordination with social service agencies, victim advocacy groups, and court systems. The paperwork associated with domestic violence cases was typically more extensive than other types of crime due to the need for protective orders, safety plans, and coordination with multiple support services. The domestic violence files on Detective Martinez's desk showed the careful documentation required to build effective cases while protecting victims from additional harm. Witness statements were often supplemented with photographs of injuries, medical records, and statements from neighbors or family members who had observed threatening behavior. These files also contained safety assessments and referrals to support services, reflecting law enforcement's recognition that criminal prosecution alone was not sufficient to address the complex dynamics of domestic violence. Fletcher observed how domestic violence cases generated ongoing paperwork even after initial arrests had been made, as investigators worked to ensure victim safety and coordinate with prosecutors preparing for trial. These cases often required regular check-ins with victims, updates to safety plans, and coordination with victim advocates, who helped navigate the complex legal and social service systems involved in addressing domestic violence. The white-collar crime section occupied a corner of the second floor where Detective Thompson maintained files related to fraud, embezzlement, and other financial crimes. These cases required different investigative techniques than street crimes, focusing on document analysis, financial records examination, and coordination with regulatory agencies and financial institutions. The paperwork associated with white-collar crimes was often voluminous, reflecting the complex paper trails that criminals created in their attempts to conceal illegal financial activity. Detective Thompson's workspace contained specialized reference materials related to accounting practices, business law, and financial regulations. These resources were essential for understanding the legitimate business practices that criminals attempted to manipulate for illegal purposes. The files on this desk often contained bank records, corporate documents, and correspondence that had been subpoenaed as part of ongoing investigations. One particular file on Detective Thompson's desk documented an embezzlement case involving a non-profit organization, a crime that had required months of careful financial analysis to uncover the methods used to divert charitable donations for personal use. The file contained detailed spreadsheets showing how small amounts had been systematically diverted over an extended period, creating a cumulative theft of substantial proportions that had gone undetected until an annual audit revealed discrepancies in financial records. The nonprofit embezzlement case illustrated the patience and analytical skill required for white-collar crime investigation, where evidence often existed in the form of seemingly legitimate financial transactions that revealed their criminal nature only when examined collectively over extended periods. Unlike violent crimes that generated immediate evidence, financial crimes often required investigators to reconstruct complex series of transactions to demonstrate criminal intent and illegal activity. Fletcher's rounds took him past a conference room where case files were occasionally spread across a large table for collaborative review by multiple investigators. Tonight, the conference room was empty, but traces of recent activity remained visible in the form of coffee-stained papers, marker boards covered with case timelines, and file folders arranged in careful patterns that suggested systematic analysis of complex evidence. Conference rooms served as a space for task force meetings, where investigators from different jurisdictions could coordinate their efforts on cases that crossed traditional boundaries. These collaborative investigations generated their own special types of documentation, including formal agreements between agencies, protocols for information sharing, and procedures for coordinating arrests and prosecutions. Across multiple jurisdictions, the task force approach to criminal investigation reflected the increasingly interconnected nature of criminal activity in the modern era. Drug trafficking, human trafficking, organized crime, and cybercrime all operated across traditional jurisdictional boundaries, requiring law enforcement agencies to develop new forms of cooperation and coordination. The documentation associated with these collaborative efforts was necessarily more complex than traditional single jurisdiction cases. Near the center of the second floor, a secure storage area contained evidence from active cases, materials that required careful handling, and chain of custody documentation. Fletcher's security clearance allowed him to check that this area remained properly secured during overnight hours, but the evidence itself was accessible only to authorized investigators working on specific cases. The storage area represented the physical manifestation of ongoing investigations, where tangible evidence waited to be analyzed or presented in court proceedings. Evidence storage protocols had evolved significantly over the decades, reflecting advances in forensic science and legal requirements for evidence handling. Modern evidence storage involved detailed logging systems, climate control for sensitive materials, and security measures designed to prevent contamination or unauthorized access. Each piece of evidence was tagged with identifying information and documentation, showing every person who had handled it since its collection. Fletcher's inspection of the evidence storage area included checking temperature and humidity, monitors that ensured optimal conditions for preserving physical evidence. Different types of evidence required different storage conditions. Biological samples needed refrigeration. Paper documents required protection from moisture and light, and electronic devices needed protection from magnetic interference and power fluctuations. The evidence storage area also contained a small laboratory workspace where investigators could conduct preliminary analysis of physical evidence before sending materials to the state crime laboratory for more sophisticated testing. This workspace contained basic equipment for photography, measurement, and documentation of physical evidence, allowing investigators to begin their analysis while waiting for more detailed laboratory results. Detective Kim's workspace specialized in cybercrime, a field that had emerged only in recent decades, but had quickly become one of the most complex and rapidly evolving areas of criminal investigation. The files on this desk contained printed copies of digital evidence, screenshots of online communications, and technical reports from computer forensic specialists who analyzed electronic devices for evidence of criminal activity. The cybercrime cases generated unique types of documentation that reflected the digital nature of the evidence involved. Traditional case files contained physical documents and photographs, but cybercrime files included printouts of electronic communications, technical analyses of computer systems, and coordination records with internet service providers and other technology companies that controlled access to digital evidence. One file on Detective Kim's desk documented an online fraud scheme that had targeted elderly victims through email and telephone contacts, convincing them to provide financial information that was then used for identity theft and unauthorized transactions. The case had required coordination with multiple banks, credit card companies, and internet service providers to trace the digital trail left by the criminals and identify the methods they used to contact potential victims. The online fraud case illustrated the global Nature of modern criminal activity, with perpetrators potentially located anywhere in the world while their victims remained local. This geographic complexity required investigators to work with federal agencies and international law enforcement organizations to identify and prosecute criminals who use technology to commit crimes across traditional boundaries. Fletcher observed how cybercrime files often contained technical documentation that required specialized knowledge to understand, reflecting the advanced technological skills that both criminals and investigators needed to operate effectively in the digital environment. These cases often involved expert witnesses who could explain complex technical matters to judges and juries unfamiliar with the intricacies of computer systems and internet communications. Juvenile cases on the second floor occupied a separate section where Detective Rodriguez maintained files related to crimes involving young people, either as perpetrators or victims. These cases required special handling procedures due to legal protections for minors and the different approaches that juvenile justice systems took toward young offenders. The documentation for juvenile cases was often more extensive than adult cases due to additional requirements for family involvement, educational coordination, and rehabilitation planning. Detective Rodriguez's workspace contained reference materials related to adolescent development, educational resources, and contact information for social service agencies that worked with young people and families. These resources reflected the recognition that juvenile cases required understanding of developmental psychology and family dynamics in addition to traditional investigative skills. The juvenile files often documented successful interventions that had helped young offenders avoid further contact with the criminal justice system, providing evidence for the effectiveness of rehabilitation-focused approaches to juvenile justice. These success stories served as reminders that appropriate intervention at early stages could redirect young lives in positive directions and prevent the development of criminal careers. Fletcher's examination of juvenile files revealed the complex coordination required between law enforcement, schools, social services, and families to address criminal behavior by young people effectively. These cases often involved multiple agencies working together to address not only the immediate criminal behavior, but also underlying family, educational, or social problems that might have contributed to the young person's involvement in illegal activity. Near the building's western windows, Detective Walsh's workspace focused on cold cases, investigations that had been suspended due to lack of leads, but remained officially open pending new evidence or investigative techniques. These files represented some of the most challenging aspects of police work, cases where traditional investigative methods had been exhausted, but where the possibility remained that new approaches or evidence might eventually lead to resolution. The cold case files on Detective Walsh's desk showed signs of periodic review and updating, evidence of ongoing efforts to identify new approaches or take advantage of advancing investigative techniques. DNA analysis, computer databases, and other technological advances had made it possible to re-examine old cases with new tools, sometimes leading to breakthroughs in cases that had been dormant for years or decades. One cold case file documented a series of residential burglaries from the 1990s that had never been solved despite extensive investigation at the time. Recent advances in fingerprint analysis and database technology had made it possible to re-examine physical evidence from these cases, leading to new leads that were currently being investigated. The file showed how patient documentation and evidence preservation could eventually pay off when new investigative tools became available. The cold case approach reflected law enforcement's commitment to seeking justice, even when initial investigations failed to produce results. These cases often involved serious crimes where victims or families continued to seek resolution despite the passage of time. The dedicated resources allocated to cold case investigation demonstrated society's recognition that some crimes were too serious to abandon simply because initial efforts had been unsuccessful. Fletcher's security rounds included checking the small library that occupied a corner of the second floor, where investigators could access reference materials related to criminal law, investigative techniques, and specialized areas of expertise. The library contained legal codes, procedural manuals, and professional journals that helped investigators stay current with evolving legal requirements and investigative best practices. The law enforcement library reflected the professional development, expectations for modern police officers who were required to maintain current knowledge of legal developments and investigative techniques through ongoing education and training. The books and journals in this library served as resources for investigators seeking to understand new legal requirements or learn about innovative approaches to criminal investigation. Fletcher had observed investigators using the library during evening hours when the building was otherwise quiet, taking advantage of the peaceful environment to research complex legal questions or study case precedents that might be relevant to their current investigations. The library provided a contemplative space where investigators could step back from the immediate pressures of casework to engage with broader professional knowledge and theoretical understanding. The library also contained historical materials that provided context for understanding how law enforcement practices had evolved over time. These resources helped contemporary investigators understand the foundations of current practices and learn from the experiences of earlier generations of police officers who had faced similar challenges with different tools and techniques. Detective Park's workspace near the library focused on gang-related crime, cases that required understanding of complex social dynamics and organizational structures that governed illegal activity in certain communities. These files often documented ongoing conflicts between rival groups and the impact that gang activity had on neighborhoods and families caught in the middle of territorial disputes. The gang cases required investigators to develop informant networks and understand the cultural codes that govern behavior within criminal organizations. These investigations often involved long-term surveillance and careful documentation of relationships and activities that revealed the structure and operations of criminal groups. The paperwork associated with gang cases was typically extensive due to the need to document complex relationships and ongoing patterns of criminal activity. Fletcher observed how gang-related files often contained sociological analysis alongside traditional criminal evidence, reflecting recognition that effective enforcement required understanding of the social conditions that contributed to gang formation and recruitment. These cases often involved coordination with community organizations and social service agencies that worked to provide alternatives to gang involvement for young people in affected neighborhoods. The gang files also documented successful intervention programs that had helped individuals leave gang life and transition to legitimate activities. These success stories provided evidence that even deeply entrenched criminal behavior could be changed through appropriate intervention and support services, offering hope for communities affected by ongoing gang activity. Near the building's central corridor, a workstation dedicated to victim services maintained files related to supporting crime victims through the investigation and prosecution process. These files documented contacts with victims, referrals to support services, and coordination with victim advocacy organizations that helped people navigate the complex legal system following their experience of crime. The victim services files reflected law enforcement's recognition that effective criminal justice required attention to the needs and concerns of crime victims, who often served as key witnesses in prosecution efforts. These files documented efforts to keep victims informed about case progress, provide referrals to appropriate support services, and ensure that victim rights were protected throughout the legal process. Fletcher's examination of victim services files revealed the emotional complexity of criminal investigation, showing how crimes affected not only the direct victims, but also their families and communities. The documentation in these files often included impact statements, counseling referrals, and coordination with victim compensation programs that help people recover from the financial and emotional consequences of criminal victimization. The victim services approach represented a significant evolution in law enforcement practice, moving from a focus solely on apprehending criminals to a more comprehensive approach that recognized the importance of supporting victims and communities affected by crime. This broader perspective generated additional documentation requirements, but also contributed to more effective investigations and prosecutions by ensuring victim cooperation and community support. As Fletcher completed his rounds of the second floor, he reflected on the complex web of documentation that supported modern criminal investigation. Each case file represented not only the specific crime being investigated, but also the broader social context in which criminal activity occurred and the institutional response that society had developed to address crime and support its victims. The second floor files showed how contemporary law enforcement had evolved into a complex professional enterprise that required specialized knowledge, technological sophistication, and extensive coordination with other agencies and organizations. The documentation requirements that supported this complexity were substantial, but they also provided the foundation for effective investigation and prosecution of criminal activity. Fletcher's nighttime observations of these files gave him unique insight into the scope and complexity of modern police work, revealing the patient professional effort that went into building cases and seeking justice for crime victims. The careful documentation and systematic approach evident in these files reflected law enforcement's commitment to professional excellence and public service. The active nature of second-floor files distinguished them from the historical records stored in the building's lower levels, but both types of documentation served important purposes in the ongoing effort to maintain public safety and seek justice for those who had been harmed by criminal activity. The continuity between historical and contemporary approaches to law enforcement provided evidence of the institutional commitment that had sustained professional policing through decades of social and technological change. Fletcher's security rounds connected him to this institutional continuity, making him a witness to the ongoing process of documentation and investigation that represented society's commitment to the rule of law and protection of its citizens. His nighttime presence in the building created a link between the historical memory preserved in the archive and the active work of contemporary criminal investigation. As Fletcher prepared to complete his inspection of the building's upper floors, he carried with him an appreciation for the dedication and professionalism that characterized modern law enforcement, evident in the careful documentation and systematic approach that governed every aspect of criminal investigation. The files he observed during his nightly rounds represented thousands of hours of professional effort devoted to seeking truth, justice, and public safety. The building's archive served as both memory and resource, preserving the lessons of the past while supporting the active work of contemporary investigation. Fletcher's role as night security guard placed him at the intersection of these functions, protecting the accumulated knowledge while ensuring that the building remained ready to support the ongoing work of seeking justice for crime victims and maintaining public safety for the community. The third floor existed in a realm between active investigation and permanent storage, a transitional space where case files awaited their final classification as either closed matters requiring long-term preservation or cold cases deserving periodic review. Here, Fletcher's footsteps moved across polished concrete floors that had been sealed but never carpeted, creating a subtle echo that seemed to carry the weight of unresolved questions and incomplete stories. The morning light that would eventually filter through the third floor's skylights never quite reached the deeper recesses of this level, where row upon row of filing cabinets stretched into shadows that seemed to hold their own counsel. These cabinets contained the accumulated documentation of decades, not the active files of ongoing investigations, but not yet the historical archives of the basement. They represented the liminal space where recent memory gradually transformed into institutional history. Detective Morrison's former workspace occupied a corner near the building's north wall, where a small window looked out over the city's older residential neighborhoods. Morrison had retired 3 years earlier after 35 years of service, but his desk remained largely unchanged, serving now as a processing station where newer detectives could examine his closed cases and learn from his investigative methods. The desk bore the accumulated marks of his long career, coffee ring stains that had become permanent fixtures, small scratches from paper clips and staplers, slight depressions where he had pressed down hard while writing countless reports. The files that covered Morrison's desk represented his final cases, investigations that he had brought to completion in his last months of service. These files showed the methodical approach that had characterized his work over 3 decades, with every piece of evidence carefully documented, every witness statement properly filed, and every follow-up action noted in his precise handwriting. Reading through these files, newer detectives could observe the patient accumulation of evidence that had made Morrison one of the department's most successful investigators. Fletcher had known Morrison during his final years of service, observing the veteran detective's late-night work sessions when complex cases required extended hours of analysis and documentation. Morrison had often worked alone on the 3rd floor during evening hours, spreading case files across multiple tables to identify patterns and connections that might not be apparent when examining individual pieces of evidence in isolation. His ability to see broader patterns in seemingly unrelated information had been legendary within the department. One of Morrison's final cases involved a series of commercial robberies that had puzzled investigators for months until Morrison recognized that the perpetrators were systematically targeting businesses that shared a particular characteristic. They all used the same private security company for their alarm systems. This insight led to the discovery that an employee of the security company had been providing inside information about alarm systems and cash handling procedures, enabling the robberies to occur with minimal risk of detection. The security company case illustrated Morrison's approach to investigation, which emphasized patient analysis of available information rather than pursuit of dramatic leads or intuitive breakthroughs. His files showed how he had methodically examined each robbery for common elements, creating detailed charts that compared locations, times, methods, and other characteristics until patterns became apparent that had been invisible when examining individual incidents. Fletcher often paused at Morrison's desk during his nightly rounds, appreciating the organizational systems that the veteran detective had developed over his long career. Color-coded folders distinguished between different types of evidence, while small flags marked documents that required follow-up action or contained particularly significant information. Cross-reference sheets helped track connections between related cases, creating a web of information that revealed patterns across multiple investigations. The filing system that Morrison had developed reflected his understanding that successful investigation required not just collection of evidence but also systematic organization that made information accessible when needed. His files contained detailed indexes that allowed quick location of specific documents, witness statements, or pieces of evidence, saving valuable time during the preparation of cases for prosecution. Near Morrison's workspace, a series of filing cabinets contained cases from the 1980s and 1990s that had been closed but remained accessible for reference purposes. These files represented successful investigations that had resulted in arrests and convictions, providing examples of effective investigative techniques that could guide contemporary cases. The closed case files served as an institutional memory bank, preserving knowledge about criminal methods and investigative responses that might be relevant to future cases. Fletcher's examination of the closed case files revealed the evolution of criminal activity over the decades, showing how criminals had adapted to new technologies and law. enforcement techniques, while investigators had simultaneously developed more sophisticated methods of evidence collection and analysis. The files from the 1980s often involved relatively straightforward crimes that could be solved through traditional investigative methods, while cases from the 1990s showed increasing complexity as criminals began using more sophisticated techniques. The drug cases from this period told a particularly clear story about changing patterns of criminal activity, with early files documenting relatively simple distribution networks that operated primarily through face-to-face transactions. As time progressed, the files showed how drug trafficking had become more organized and technologically sophisticated, with criminals using pagers, cellular phones, and eventually more advanced communication methods to coordinate their activities while avoiding law enforcement detection. Detective Williams had specialized in narcotics investigation during the 1990s, and her closed case files occupied an entire section of third-floor storage. These files documented her patient work in developing informant networks and conducting long-term surveillance operations that eventually disrupted major drug distribution organizations. Reading through her cases, it was possible to trace the gradual sophistication of both criminal methods and law enforcement responses as the war on drugs intensified during this period. One of Williams' most significant cases involved a drug distribution network that had operated for several years before being detected, using a series of legitimate businesses as fronts for money laundering and distribution activities. The investigation had required months of surveillance and financial analysis to understand the structure of the organization and identify all participants. The final case file was several inches thick, documenting the complex process of building a case that could withstand legal challenge and result in successful prosecution of the organization's leadership. The money laundering aspects of Williams' drug cases represented an early example of the increasing importance of financial investigation in criminal cases. As criminal organizations became more sophisticated, they developed elaborate methods for concealing the proceeds of illegal activity, requiring law enforcement to develop expertise in financial analysis and coordination with banking institutions and regulatory agencies. Fletcher observed how the drug investigation files from this period contained extensive documentation of coordination with federal agencies, reflecting the multi-jurisdictional nature of drug trafficking cases. Local police departments had to develop new protocols for sharing information and coordinating operations with state and federal law enforcement agencies, generating additional paperwork, but also providing access to resources and expertise that made complex investigations possible. Third floor also contained files from the domestic violence unit that had been established in the early 1990s, representing law enforcement's growing recognition that domestic violence required specialized approaches and expertise. These files documented the development of new protocols for responding to domestic violence calls, conducting investigations in sensitive family situations, and coordinating with social service agencies and victim advocacy organizations. Detective Chun had been one of the founding members of the Domestic Violence Unit, and her closed case files showed the evolution of investigative techniques and legal approaches to domestic violence over the course of her career. Early files from the 1990s often documented cases where limited legal options and social attitudes had made successful prosecution difficult, while later files showed the impact of new legislation and changing social awareness that had made more effective interventions possible. The domestic violence files often contained extensive documentation of victim safety, planning, and coordination with support services, reflecting recognition that criminal prosecution alone was not sufficient to address the complex dynamics of abusive relationships. These cases required ongoing attention even after arrests had been made, as investigators worked to ensure victim safety and coordinate with prosecutors preparing for trial. Fletcher found the domestic violence cases particularly compelling because they illustrated so clearly how law enforcement practices had evolved in response to better understanding of complex social problems. The files showed how officers had learned to recognize signs of domestic violence that might not be immediately apparent, how they had developed techniques for conducting interviews with traumatized victims, and how they had built relationships with community organizations that provided essential support services. Asterisk. One section of the third floor contained files related to white-collar crime investigations from the 1990s, cases that had required investigators to develop new expertise in financial analysis and business practices. These files documented some of the department's first encounters with computer-related fraud, investment schemes, and other sophisticated financial crimes that would become increasingly common in subsequent decades. Detective Rodriguez had pioneered the department's white-collar crime investigations, often working alone on cases that required him to master complex financial concepts and business practices that had not been part of traditional police training. His files showed the patient process of learning new skills while simultaneously investigating complex cases that often involved multiple jurisdictions and extensive coordination with regulatory agencies and financial institutions. The white-collar crime files from this period often contained extensive correspondence with banks, accounting firms, and regulatory agencies that had provided expertise and assistance in understanding complex financial transactions. These cases had required investigators to build relationships with professionals outside law enforcement and learn to navigate regulatory systems that operated according to different procedures and timelines than traditional criminal investigation. Fletcher's examination of the white-collar crime files revealed how these cases had often required years to complete, as investigators worked to understand complex financial schemes and gather evidence that could withstand challenge by sophisticated defense attorneys. The successful prosecution of these cases had required not only investigative skill but also the ability to explain complex financial concepts to judges and juries unfamiliar with business practices and financial regulations. Near the center of the third floor, a large table served as a workspace where investigators could spread out multiple case files for comparative analysis, looking for patterns or connections that might not be apparent when examining individual cases in isolation. The table bore the marks of decades of use, with slight stains and scratches that testified to countless hours of careful analysis and note-taking. Tonight, the table held several files from the early 2000s, cases that someone had been reviewing for potential patterns or connections. The files appeared to relate to a series of residential burglaries that had shared certain characteristics, suggesting the possibility of common perpetrators or methods. Small sticky notes marked particular pages, and a legal pad contained handwritten notes comparing details from different cases. The comparative analysis approach represented an important development in investigative technique, reflecting recognition that many crimes were committed by repeat offenders who developed characteristic methods and target selection patterns. By analyzing multiple cases systematically, investigators could identify these patterns and potentially link crimes that might otherwise appear unrelated. Fletcher observed how the analysis of repeat offender patterns had led to the development of more sophisticated database systems that could identify potential connections between cases automatically, saving investigators time and helping them identify suspects more quickly. These technological advances had built upon the foundation of careful manual analysis that investigators like Morrison had pioneered during their careers. The third floor also contained files from the department's first computer crimes unit, established in the late 1990s as personal computers and internet access became more widespread. These early cybercrime files documented law enforcement's initial encounters with online fraud, computer hacking, and other technology-related crimes that would eventually become major areas of concern for law enforcement agencies. Detective Park had been assigned to developed the department's computer crime capabilities, often working with minimal resources and little precedent to guide his efforts. His files documented the process of learning new technologies while simultaneously investigating cases that required expertise that few people possessed at the time. The early cybercrime files showed how investigators had to develop new techniques and procedures without established protocols or specialized training. The evolution of computer crime investigation was clearly visible in Park's files, which showed how cases that initially required weeks of analysis eventually became routine as investigators developed expertise and acquired better tools for analyzing electronic evidence. The files also documented the department's efforts to build relationships with internet service providers and technology companies that could provide assistance in obtaining electronic evidence. Fletcher found the early cybercrime files particularly interesting because they illustrated how law enforcement had adapted to entirely new types of criminal activity that had no historical precedent. Unlike traditional crimes that had been occurring for centuries, computer crimes required investigators to develop completely new approaches and techniques while learning to use technologies that were themselves rapidly evolving. One section of the third floor contained files related to organized crime investigations that had required extensive surveillance and coordination with federal agencies. These files documented some of the most complex and sensitive investigations in the department's history, cases that had required years of patient work to penetrate criminal organizations and gather evidence that could result in successful prosecutions. Detective Martinez had specialized in organized crime investigation during the 1990s, working closely with federal agencies on cases that often crossed multiple jurisdictions and required sophisticated surveillance techniques. His files contained extensive documentation of surveillance operations, wiretap transcripts, and financial analysis that had been necessary to understand the structure and operations of criminal organizations. Organized crime files often contained information that remained sensitive years after the original investigations had been completed, requiring special security protocols and limited access even within the police department. These cases had often involved witnesses who required ongoing protection and evidence that could compromise other investigations. If it became public knowledge, Fletcher's security clearance allowed him to observe these files during his nightly rounds, but their contents remained largely sealed to protect ongoing investigations and witness safety. The mere presence of these files on the third floor served as a reminder of the serious and sometimes dangerous nature of law enforcement work, particularly investigations that targeted sophisticated criminal organizations. The organized crime investigations had required investigators to develop expertise in surveillance techniques, financial analysis, and legal procedures that went far beyond traditional police work. These cases had often involved coordination with prosecutors from the earliest stages of investigation, ensuring that evidence collection met the high standards required for prosecution of complex criminal enterprises. Near the building's western wall, a series of filing cabinets contained cases from the juvenile division, documenting law enforcement's evolving approach to crimes involving young people during the 1990s and early 2000s. These files showed how juvenile justice had gradually shifted from primarily punitive approaches toward more rehabilitation-oriented strategies that took into account the developmental needs and potential of young offenders. Detective Thompson had worked extensively with juvenile cases during this period, developing programs that connected young offenders with educational and employment opportunities as alternatives to traditional criminal justice processing. Her files documented numerous cases where appropriate intervention had helped young people avoid further involvement in criminal activity and develop positive life directions. The juvenile files often contained extensive documentation of family involvement and coordination with schools and social service agencies. reflecting recognition that effective intervention with young offenders required addressing broader social and family issues that might have contributed to criminal behavior. These cases typically required more extensive documentation than adult cases due to additional legal protections for minors and requirements for family involvement in legal proceedings. Fletcher observed how the juvenile cases from this period often had more hopeful outcomes than adult criminal cases, with many files documenting successful interventions that had redirected young lives in positive directions. These success stories provided evidence for the effectiveness of rehabilitation-oriented approaches to juvenile justice and demonstrated the importance of early intervention in preventing the development of criminal careers. The third floor's layout created natural gathering areas where investigators could collaborate on complex cases or share expertise across different specializations. These informal collaboration spaces had fostered the development of innovative approaches to criminal investigation and had helped individual officers learn from colleagues with different areas of expertise. One corner of the third floor had been configured as a small conference area where investigators could meet with prosecutors, social service representatives, or experts from other agencies. The files stored near this area documented numerous collaborative efforts that had brought together professionals from different disciplines to address complex cases that required multiple types of expertise. The collaborative approach to criminal investigation represented an important evolution in law enforcement practice, moving away from the traditional model where individual officers worked independently toward recognition that complex cases often required team efforts that drew upon different areas of expertise. This collaborative approach had generated additional documentation requirements, but had also led to more effective investigations and better outcomes for crime victims. Fletcher's nightly observations of the third floor files gave him insight into the institutional memory that guided contemporary law enforcement practice. The cases stored on this floor represented the foundation of knowledge and experience that current investigators drew upon when facing new challenges, providing examples of effective techniques and approaches that had been tested and refined over years of practical application. The transition from active investigation to institutional memory occurred gradually on the third floor as cases moved from current concern to historical reference. This transition process ensured that valuable knowledge and experience were not lost when individual officers retired or transferred to other positions, maintaining continuity in investigative capability and institutional wisdom. As Fletcher completed his rounds of the third floor, he reflected on the accumulated expertise that these files represented, the patient professional effort that had gone into building the department's capacity to address complex criminal cases. The documentation stored on this floor served as both memory and resource, preserving hard-won knowledge while providing guidance for future investigations. Third floor existed as a bridge between the active investigations of the second floor and the historical archives of the basement, capturing the moment when current cases became institutional memory. Fletcher's role as guardian of this space connected him to the ongoing process of knowledge, preservation, and institutional continuity that sustained effective law enforcement across generations of officers and investigators. The files resting in the third floor's quiet spaces held stories of professional dedication, investigative innovation, and the gradual development of expertise that had made the department capable of addressing increasingly complex criminal challenges. These stories continued to influence contemporary practice, providing guidance and inspiration for current investigators who faced similar challenges with newer tools and techniques. Fletcher's nighttime presence among these files created a connection between past and present, between the accumulated wisdom of previous generations and the ongoing work of contemporary law enforcement. His security rounds protected not just physical documents, but also the institutional memory that these files represented, ensuring that hard-won knowledge remained available to guide future investigations and serve the ongoing cause of justice and public safety. Asterisk. The old courthouse stood 3 blocks from the police archive building, its limestone facade weathered by decades of rain and wind into a patina that spoke of enduring purpose and institutional gravitas. During daylight hours, the courthouse buzzed with activity as lawyers, judges, clerks, and citizens moved through its corridors, pursuing the complex business of justice. But at night, when the last hearing had concluded and the final document had been filed, the building settled into a profound silence that seemed to amplify the weight of all the decisions that had been made within its walls. Fletcher's extended security rounds sometimes took him beyond the archive building to check on related facilities, including the courthouse where many of the cases documented in the police files had ultimately been decided. Tonight, walking through the empty streets between the 2 buildings, he found himself contemplating the relationship between investigation and adjudication, between the patient work of gathering evidence and the formal process of determining guilt or innocence. The courthouse's main entrance was flanked by columns that had been carved from single blocks of granite, their surfaces polished smooth by the hands of countless people who had climbed the broad steps seeking justice or resolution. Above the entrance, words carved into the limestone proclaimed the building's dedication to equal justice under law, a principle that had guided the proceedings within these walls for over a century. Inside the courthouse, the marble floors bore the subtle wear patterns created by decades of foot traffic, with slightly lighter areas marking the paths that people most commonly followed between courtrooms, offices, and the public areas where families and attorneys waited for proceedings to begin. The wear patterns told their own story about the building's use, revealing the routes that people had traced millions of times in pursuit of legal resolution. The main corridor stretched the length of the building, lined with doorways that led to individual courtrooms where different types of cases were heard according to carefully maintained schedules. Each courtroom had its own character and history, shaped by the thousands of cases that had been decided within its walls, and the generations of judges who had presided over legal proceedings. From the elevated bench that symbolized the authority of law, courtroom, had been designated for criminal cases, and its interior reflected the serious nature of the proceedings conducted there. Dark wood paneling rose halfway up the walls, topped by cream-colored plaster that had been painted and repainted numerous times over the decades. The judge's bench was elevated several feet above the courtroom floor, creating a physical representation of judicial authority that commanded respect and attention from all participants in legal proceedings. The witness stand occupied a position to the right of the judge's bench, where countless individuals had provided testimony under oath about events they had observed or experienced. The chair itself showed signs of wear from the nervous movements of witnesses who had struggled to recall details. Under the pressure of formal questioning, their shifting and fidgeting gradually, wearing away the chair's original finish in subtle but permanent ways. Fletcher had observed many criminal trials during his years as a police officer before taking his current security position, and he understood the careful protocols that governed courtroom proceedings. The formal structure of trials served important purposes, ensuring that evidence was presented systematically and that defendants received fair treatment regardless of the nature of the charges they faced. The jury box contained 12 seats arranged in 2 rows, each position marked by slight differences in wear and comfort that reflected the countless hours that citizens had spent fulfilling their civic duty to serve as jurors. The responsibility of jury service was taken seriously by most people, and the evidence of their careful attention was visible in the notes and deliberation materials that were occasionally left behind after verdicts had been reached. Behind the courtroom's public seating area, a small observation gallery allowed family members, reporters, and other interested parties to observe proceedings while maintaining appropriate separation from the formal legal process. The gallery's wooden benches bore the marks of emotional responses to trial proceedings, with small scratches and worn areas that testified to the anxiety and stress that families experienced while watching their loved ones face criminal charges. The court clerk's desk occupied a position near the judge's bench, where official records were maintained and legal documents were managed during trial proceedings. The desk's surface showed the accumulated wear of decades of paperwork, with slight indentations from countless signatures and small stains from coffee cups that had provided necessary caffeine during long trial days. Fletcher's examination of courtroom revealed the careful attention to detail that characterized all aspects of formal legal proceedings. Every element of the courtroom's design and layout served specific purposes related to the administration of justice, from the positioning of participants to the acoustic properties that ensured testimony could be clearly heard by all participants. Adjacent to the main courtroom, a small conference room provided space for attorneys to meet with clients and witnesses during trial proceedings. The room contained a simple table and chairs, but its walls bore the emotional residue of countless difficult conversations, where legal strategies were discussed and defendants learned about the potential consequences of the charges they faced. Conference room's atmosphere was markedly different from the formal courtroom, creating a more intimate space where attorneys could provide counsel and support to clients who were navigating the complex legal system. The room's modest furnishings reflected its practical purpose, but the emotional weight of the conversations conducted there was palpable even in its empty nighttime silence. Courtroom B specialized in civil cases, and its interior had a slightly different character that reflected the non-criminal nature of the proceedings conducted there. The same formal structure existed, with an elevated judge's bench and designated areas for attorneys and parties, but the atmosphere was less austere, reflecting the civil law's focus on resolving disputes rather than determining criminal guilt. The civil courtroom had witnessed thousands of cases involving contract disputes, personal injury claims, property disagreements, and family law matters that required judicial resolution. These cases often involved complex factual situations and legal principles that required careful analysis and deliberation, generating extensive documentation that eventually found its way into the court's permanent records. Fletcher observed how the civil courtroom's layout facilitated the presentation of documentary evidence and expert testimony that were common in civil cases. Tables were positioned to accommodate the numerous files and exhibits that civil attorneys typically brought to trial, and sight lines were configured to ensure that judges and juries could easily examine physical evidence and demonstrative materials. The family court section occupied a separate wing of the building, where sensitive cases involving domestic relations, child custody, and juvenile matters were handled with special attention to privacy and the protection of vulnerable parties. These courtrooms had been modified to create more comfortable environments for children and families dealing with difficult personal situations. Juvenile courtroom featured less formal seating arrangements and more subdued lighting, reflecting recognition that young people required different treatment than adult defendants. The judge's bench was lower than in adult courtrooms, and additional seating was provided for family members, social workers, and other professionals who participated in juvenile proceedings as part of the rehabilitation-focused approach that governed juvenile justice. Fletcher had observed juvenile proceedings during his police career and appreciated the different atmosphere that characterized these cases. The focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment created opportunities for positive outcomes that were less common in adult criminal cases, though it also required more extensive coordination with social service agencies and educational institutions. Probation office occupied space adjacent to the courtrooms, where officers worked to supervise individuals who had been sentenced to community-based alternatives to incarceration. The probation files contained detailed documentation of supervision plans, progress reports, and the various programs and services that helped probationers successfully complete their sentences while remaining in the community. Probation. Supervision represented an important alternative to incarceration that allowed individuals to maintain employment and family relationships while serving their sentences. The success of probation programs depended on careful monitoring and the availability of support services that addressed the underlying issues that had contributed to criminal behavior. Fletcher's security rounds included checking the probation offices, where case files documented both successful completions of probation supervision and violations that had resulted in additional legal consequences. The files showed how probation officers worked to balance enforcement of court orders with support for individuals trying to rebuild their lives after criminal convictions. The court reporter's office contained the specialized equipment used to create official transcripts of court proceedings, ensuring that accurate records existed for appeals and other legal purposes. The court reporters who worked in this building had developed exceptional skills in capturing not just the words spoken during trials, but also the nuances of tone and emphasis that could be legally significant. The transcription equipment had evolved significantly over the decades, moving from manual stenography machines to digital recording systems that could capture proceedings with greater accuracy and efficiency. However, the fundamental importance of creating accurate records remained constant, as these transcripts often served as the primary evidence for appellate courts reviewing trial court decisions. Fletcher observed how the court reporter's office maintained extensive files of trial transcripts, organized chronologically and indexed to facilitate retrieval when needed for appeals or other legal purposes. These transcripts represented another form of institutional memory, preserving the exact words spoken during legal proceedings for future reference and analysis. The law library occupied an entire floor of the courthouse, where attorneys and judges could research legal precedents and statutory requirements that governed their cases. The library contained thousands of volumes of case reports, statutes, and legal treatises that provided the foundation for legal arguments and judicial decisions. Despite the increasing availability of legal research through electronic databases, the physical law library remained an important resource for legal professionals who needed to examine historical sources or conduct detailed research that required access to multiple resources simultaneously. The library's collection represented centuries of legal development and provided essential context for understanding contemporary legal issues. Fletcher's examination of the law library revealed the accumulated wisdom that guided legal decision-making, with shelves upon shelves of case reports documenting how courts had addressed similar legal questions in previous cases. The principle of precedent that governed legal reasoning meant that past decisions continued to influence contemporary cases, creating continuity across decades and centuries of legal development. The library also contains specialized collections related to local legal history, including records of significant cases that had been decided in this courthouse and biographical information about the judges and attorneys who had shaped the local legal community. These historical materials provided context for understanding how legal practice had evolved and how contemporary procedures had developed from earlier traditions. Near the center of the courthouse, the jury assembly room provided space where citizens reported for jury duty and waited to be selected for service on specific cases. The room contained comfortable seating and informational materials about the jury system, creating an environment that helped citizens understand their important role in the administration of justice. The jury assembly process represented one of the most direct ways that ordinary citizens participated in the legal system, and the courthouse staff worked carefully to ensure that jury service was both meaningful and manageable for the people called to serve. The assembly room's design reflected this commitment, providing comfort and information while maintaining the dignity appropriate to civic service. Fletcher had great respect for the citizens who served as jurors. understanding the significant responsibility they accepted when they agreed to listen to evidence and make decisions that could dramatically affect the lives of defendants and crime victims. The jury system represented a fundamental commitment to democratic participation in the administration of justice. The judges' chambers occupied private offices where legal research and case preparation took place away from the public areas of the courthouse. These offices contained extensive legal libraries and provided quiet spaces for the careful consideration that judicial decision-making required. Each judge's chambers reflected their individual approach to legal analysis and case management. The judges who presided in this courthouse had developed reputations for fairness, legal knowledge, and judicial temperament that served the community well. Their decisions influenced not only the individual cases before them, but also the broader development of legal principles that would guide future cases and shape the evolution of local legal practice. Fletcher's security rounds sometimes brought him past the judges' chambers during evening hours when judicial officers worked late preparing for complex cases or writing detailed opinions that explained their legal reasoning. The dedication that judges showed to their responsibilities was evident in the long hours they spent ensuring that their decisions were based on careful analysis of law and evidence. The clerk of court's office maintained the official records of all proceedings conducted in the courthouse, creating a comprehensive archive of legal documents that paralleled the criminal case files stored in the police archive building. These court records documented not just the outcomes of cases, but also the legal reasoning and procedural steps that had led to final decisions. The court record served multiple purposes, providing documentation for appeals, research material for legal scholars, and historical records that tracked the evolution of legal practice and judicial decision-making. The careful maintenance of these records ensured that the courthouse's institutional memory remained accessible for future reference and analysis. Fletcher observed how the clerk's office operated according to strict protocols that ensured the accuracy and security of court records, with multiple verification procedures and backup systems that protected against loss or corruption of important legal documents. The integrity of court records was essential for maintaining public confidence in the legal system. The building's basement contained storage areas for older court records, creating an archive similar to the police files stored in the neighboring building. These basement archives held the documented history of legal decisions stretching back over a century, providing researchers and legal professionals with access to historical precedents and information about the development of local legal practice. The courthouse archives represented another form of institutional memory, preserving not just the outcomes of individual cases, but also the evolving approaches to legal interpretation and judicial administration that had shaped the local legal community. These records provided essential context for understanding how contemporary legal practice had developed from earlier traditions and precedents. Fletcher's exploration of the courthouse basement revealed filing systems similar to those he knew from the police archive, with careful organization by date, case type, and legal significance that made historical records accessible to researchers and legal professionals. The basement's climate-controlled environment protected paper records from deterioration while maintaining their accessibility for legitimate research purposes. The relationship between the courthouse archives and the police archive building represented the interconnected nature of the criminal justice system, where investigation and adjudication work together to serve the broader goal of maintaining public safety and ensuring justice for crime victims. The documentation maintained by both institutions created a comprehensive record of society's efforts to address criminal activity through professional law, enforcement, and fair legal procedures. As Fletcher completed his nighttime exploration of the courthouse, he reflected on the formal dignity that characterized this building and its role in the community's pursuit of justice. The courthouse represented the culmination of the investigative work documented in the police archives, the place where evidence and testimony were formally presented and where legal decisions were made according to established principles of due process and equal protection. The empty courtrooms and quiet corridors held the accumulated weight of thousands of legal decisions that had affected individuals, families, and the broader community. The building's nighttime silence provided space for reflection on the serious responsibilities that legal professionals accepted when they participated in the administration of justice. Fletcher's role as a guardian of institutional memory extended beyond the police archives to include appreciation for the courthouse's complementary function in the criminal justice system. Both buildings serve the same fundamental purpose of protecting public safety and ensuring justice, though through different methods and procedures that reflected their distinct roles in the overall system. The courthouse's formal procedures and careful documentation created accountability and transparency that ensured legal decisions could be reviewed and appealed when necessary. This system of checks and balances provided protection against arbitrary decisions and helped maintain public confidence in the fairness and integrity of legal proceedings. Walking back through the quiet streets toward the police archive building, Fletcher carried with him a renewed appreciation for the institutional framework that supported the rule of law in his community. The courthouse and police archive represented different aspects of the same commitment to justice, working together to investigate crimes, preserve evidence, and ensure that legal decisions were based on careful analysis of facts and law. The nighttime quiet that surrounded both buildings created an atmosphere conducive to reflection on the serious responsibilities that these institutions carried on behalf of the community. The accumulated documentation in both locations represented society's commitment to maintaining order through professional law enforcement and fair legal procedures rather than through arbitrary power or personal vengeance. Fletcher's security duties connected him to this larger institutional purpose, making him a guardian not just of physical buildings and documents, but also of the principles and procedures that these institutions represented. His nighttime presence ensured that the work of justice could continue, supported by secure facilities and protected records that preserved the knowledge and evidence necessary for effective law enforcement and fair legal proceedings. Asterisk. The residential district that stretched east from the courthouse contained streets lined with houses that had witnessed generations of family life, their brick facades and wooden porches holding stories that intersected with the criminal cases documented in the police archives in ways both subtle and profound. These were the neighborhoods where many of the crimes had occurred, where witnesses had lived, and where the families affected by criminal activity had tried to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of legal proceedings. Fletcher's occasional walking rounds through these residential streets during the quiet hours before dawn provided him with a different perspective on the cases he encountered in the archive building. Here, the abstract documentation of police reports and court records took on human dimensions as he observed the actual locations where crimes had occurred and families had been affected by encounters with the criminal justice system. The Morrison family had lived on Elm Street for 3 generations before their involvement in a case that had consumed Detective Morrison's attention during his final years of service. The house itself bore no external signs of its connection to criminal investigation, appearing identical to its neighbors with its modest front porch, small front yard, and the kind of careful maintenance that spoke of residents who took pride in their property and neighborhood. The case file that bore the Morrison family name told a more complex story about how criminal activity could emerge from seemingly stable family situations. The investigation had revealed financial pressures and family conflicts that had remained hidden from neighbors and friends until criminal charges had been filed in court. Proceedings had made private family matters part of the public record. Fletcher had read portions of the Morrison family case file during his nighttime review of Detective Morrison's closed cases, learning how financial difficulties had led one family member to embezzlement that had eventually been discovered through routine auditing procedures. The case had required sensitive handling due to the family's long-standing reputation in the community and the complexity of relationships that had been affected by the criminal activity. The investigation had revealed how financial crimes often developed gradually over extended periods, with small initial violations growing into more serious offenses as perpetrators became more confident and financial pressures increased. The Morrison family case had shown how even people with strong community ties and family relationships could find themselves involved in criminal activity when facing desperate financial circumstances. Walking past the Morrison house during his pre-dawn rounds, Fletcher could see signs of the family's continued presence in the community despite the legal difficulties they had experienced. The well-maintained property and seasonal decorations suggested that the family had worked to rebuild their reputation and relationships following the resolution of criminal charges against their relative. The neighborhood's response to the Morrison family case had illustrated the complex ways that communities dealt with criminal activity involving long-term residents. Some neighbors had provided support and encouragement during the legal proceedings, while others had maintained distance until the family had demonstrated their commitment to making amends and preventing future problems. 2 blocks south on Maple Street, the Rodriguez house had been the scene of a domestic violence case that had required multiple police responses over several months before Detective Martinez had been able to build a case that resulted in successful prosecution of the abusive family member. The house's exterior appearance gave no indication of the violence that had occurred within its walls, presenting the same modest residential facade as its neighbors. The domestic violence case had illustrated the challenges that law enforcement faced when investigating crimes that occurred within families, where victims often felt conflicted about cooperating with police due to emotional attachments, financial dependence, or fear of retaliation. Detective Martinez had worked patiently to build trust with the victim and develop evidence that could support prosecution even if the victim became unwilling or unable to testify. The Rodriguez case file had documented the careful coordination required between police investigators, victim advocates, social service agencies, and prosecutors to address domestic violence effectively. The case had required safety planning for the victim and children, coordination with schools and employers who needed to be aware of potential threats, and ongoing monitoring to ensure that protective orders were being observed. Fletcher had observed how domestic violence cases often required ongoing attention, even after criminal charges had been resolved, as families worked to heal from trauma and rebuild relationships in healthier ways. The success of these cases often depended on the availability of counseling services, support groups, and other resources that helped families address the underlying issues that had contributed to violent behavior. The house itself had remained in the family, with the victim eventually rebuilding her life following the successful prosecution of her abuser. The property showed signs of renewal and improvement that suggested healing and recovery, with a new garden planted in the front yard and fresh paint that indicated the residents' investment in creating a more positive living environment. The neighborhood's response to the domestic violence case had been mixed, with some residents offering support and assistance, while others had preferred to maintain distance from what they viewed as private family matters. The case had provided education about domestic violence for the broader community, helping neighbors understand how they could recognize signs of abuse and provide appropriate support to victims. On Oak Street, the Thompson house had been burglarized 3 times over a 2-year period before. Detective Williams had identified the pattern that linked these crimes to a larger series of residential burglaries throughout the neighborhood. The house bore subtle signs of the security improvements that the family had made following the burglaries. with new locks, security lighting, and an alarm system that had been installed to prevent future incidents. Burglary investigation had revealed how criminals often targeted the same neighborhoods repeatedly, developing familiarity with local patterns of activity and identifying houses that appeared to offer good opportunities for theft with minimal risk of detection. The Thompson house had been selected because it was unoccupied during predictable hours and contained valuable items that were visible through windows. Detective Williams had eventually solved the burglary series by identifying a suspect who had been systematically targeting houses in several neighborhoods, using information gathered through casual observation of residents' routines and property contents. The investigation had required extensive surveillance and coordination with other jurisdictions where similar crimes had been occurring. The Thompson family's experience with repeated burglary had illustrated how property crimes affected not just the immediate financial losses, but also the sense of security and privacy that people expected in their homes. The psychological impact of burglary often persisted long after stolen property had been replaced, affecting families' comfort and peace of mind in their own living spaces. Fletcher observed how the Thompson house had been modified to reduce its vulnerability to future crimes, with strategic landscaping that eliminated hiding places near windows and doors, improved lighting that made nighttime approach more visible, and security measures that would alert residents and authorities to any unauthorized entry attempts. The neighborhood had responded to the burglary series by organizing informal watch programs and improving communication among residents about suspicious activities. These community-based crime prevention efforts had complemented law enforcement investigations and had helped reduce criminal opportunities throughout the area. Further down Oak Street, the Chun family house had been affected by a case that had required Detective Park's early expertise in computer crimes, when their teenage son had become involved in online activities that had eventually led to criminal charges for computer fraud. The case had been among the first cybercrime investigations in the department's history, requiring new approaches and techniques that had no established precedents. Computer fraud case had illustrated how technology was creating new types of criminal opportunities, particularly for young people who possessed technical skills but lacked understanding of legal boundaries and ethical responsibilities. The Chun family case had involved online activities that had seemed harmless to the teenager but had actually constituted serious violations of federal computer crime laws. Detective Park had worked closely with the family to understand the technical aspects of the case while also addressing the educational and family counseling needs that had been identified during the investigation. The case had required coordination with federal agencies that had jurisdiction over computer crimes, creating additional complexity for the family as they navigated multiple legal systems. The resolution of the computer fraud case had involved a plea agreement that emphasized rehabilitation and education rather than incarceration, recognizing that the young person had acted without full understanding of the legal implications of his online activities. The family had been required to participate in counseling and education programs designed to prevent future involvement in computer-related crimes. Fletcher had observed how the Chun family had worked to rebuild their reputation in the community following the resolution of the computer fraud case. The teenager had eventually pursued legitimate career opportunities in technology, using his skills in ways that contributed positively to society rather than engaging in illegal activities. The neighborhood's response to the computer fraud case had reflected the general community confusion about cybercrimes, which were not well understood by most residents at the time. The case had provided education about online safety and legal responsibilities, helping other families understand how to guide their children's use of technology in appropriate ways. On Pine Street, the Williams house had been the focus of a drug investigation that had required months of surveillance before Detective Chun had been able to gather sufficient evidence to obtain search warrants and make arrests. The house appeared unremarkable from the street, giving no external indication of the criminal activity that had been occurring within its walls. The drug investigation had revealed how residential neighborhoods could be used as bases for illegal drug distribution, with criminals taking advantage of the privacy and normalcy of suburban settings to conduct illegal activities with reduced risk of detection. The Williams house had been used as both a storage location and a meeting place for drug transactions. Detective Chun had developed the drug case through a combination of surveillance, informant information, and coordination with other law enforcement agencies that had been investigating related criminal activities. The case had required careful documentation of activities observed over many months, building a comprehensive picture of the drug distribution operation. Investigation had also revealed connections between the local drug activities and larger criminal organizations, requiring coordination with state and federal agencies that had jurisdiction over interstate drug trafficking. The case had demonstrated how local criminal activity was often part of much larger criminal enterprises that crossed traditional jurisdictional boundaries. The resolution of the drug case had resulted in multiple arrests and the seizure of substantial quantities of illegal drugs and related criminal proceeds. The house itself had been subject to civil forfeiture proceedings due to its use in drug trafficking, illustrating how property could become involved in criminal investigations beyond just serving as crime scenes. The neighborhood had experienced significant relief following the resolution of the drug case, with residents reporting reduced concerns about safety and property values. The case had illustrated how criminal activity in residential areas affected entire communities, not just the immediate participants in illegal activities. The Martinez family on Cedar Street had been affected by a gang-related incident that had required Detective Rodriguez's specialized knowledge of gang activities and territorial disputes. The family's teenage son had not been directly involved in gang activities but had been injured during a confrontation between rival groups that had occurred near their home. The gang case had illustrated how criminal activity could affect innocent community members who happened to be in proximity to conflicts between criminal groups. The Martinez family had been forced to consider relocating to ensure their son's safety, as gang-related violence often involved ongoing conflicts that could continue over extended periods. Detective Rodriguez had worked with the family to develop safety strategies and coordinate with community organizations that provided support to families affected by gang violence. The case had required understanding of complex social dynamics and territorial disputes that governed gang behavior in the community. The investigation had also involved coordination with schools and youth organizations that worked to provide alternatives to gang involvement for young people in affected neighborhoods. The collaborative approach had helped address not just the immediate criminal activity, but also the underlying social conditions that contributed to gang formation and recruitment. Fletcher observed how the Martinez family had eventually remained in their neighborhood following the implementation of enhanced security measures and community-based violence prevention programs. Their experience had contributed to broader community efforts to address gang-related problems through a combination of law enforcement action and social intervention. Asterisk. The neighborhood response to gang-related violence had involved increased cooperation with law enforcement and the development of community-based programs designed to provide positive alternatives for young people who might otherwise be vulnerable to gang recruitment. These preventive approaches had complemented traditional law enforcement responses to gang activity. Johnson House on Birch Street had been involved in a financial fraud case that had required Detective Thompson's expertise in white-collar crime investigation. The case had involved investment fraud that had affected multiple families in the neighborhood, with the Johnson House serving as the location where fraudulent investment meetings had been conducted. The financial fraud case had illustrated how white-collar criminals often used residential settings to create appearances of legitimacy and respectability for their illegal schemes. The use of a private home for investment meetings had helped the perpetrator avoid the regulatory oversight that would have applied to commercial investment activities. Detective Thompson had developed the fraud case through careful analysis of financial records and coordination with regulatory agencies that had authority over investment activities. The investigation had required understanding of complex financial instruments and investment regulations that were not typically part of criminal investigations. Case had also involved coordination with victims who had lost substantial amounts of money to the fraudulent investment scheme, requiring sensitive handling of people who were dealing with both financial losses and feelings of betrayal by someone they had trusted with their savings. The resolution of the financial fraud case had resulted in criminal charges against the perpetrator and civil actions to recover stolen funds for victims. However, the complexity of the financial scheme had made full recovery difficult, leaving some victims with permanent financial losses despite the successful prosecution. The neighborhood had learned important lessons about investment, safety, and the need to verify the credentials and regulatory status of anyone offering investment opportunities. The case had provided education about how to recognize potential fraud schemes and protect personal financial information from criminal exploitation. As Fletcher completed his walking tour through the residential neighborhoods connected to various criminal cases, he reflected on how these streets and houses represented the human context within which criminal activity occurred and was addressed. The neat suburban facades concealed complex family dynamics, financial pressures, and personal struggles that sometimes led to criminal behavior. The neighborhood showed signs of resilience and recovery, with families and communities working to address the problems that had brought them into contact with the criminal justice system. The ongoing life of these streets provided evidence that people could overcome involvement in criminal activity and rebuild positive relationships with their communities. Fletcher's nighttime observations connected the abstract documentation of police files and court records to the real human experiences of families and neighborhoods affected by criminal activity. The residential streets provided context for understanding how criminal cases developed from real social situations and how legal resolutions affected the ongoing lives of all participants. Community response to various criminal cases had shown both the challenges and opportunities that arose when criminal activity affected residential neighborhoods. While some residents had responded with fear and withdrawal, others had become more actively involved in crime prevention and community building efforts that strengthened neighborhood relationships. Walking back toward the police archive building as dawn approached, Fletcher carried with him a renewed appreciation for the human context that surrounded the criminal cases documented in the files he guarded each night. The residential neighborhoods provided essential perspective on how criminal activity affected real people and communities, and how the work of law enforcement and criminal justice served the broader goal of maintaining safe and healthy communities for all residents. The connection between case files and residential neighborhoods reminded Fletcher that the work documented in the police archive was ultimately about serving people and communities, not just processing paperwork and following procedures. The human stories behind the criminal cases provided meaning and purpose for the institutional work of law enforcement and criminal justice. Asterisk. The evidence storage facility occupied the basement level of a converted warehouse 2 streets behind the mine police archive building, its concrete floors and climate-controlled atmosphere creating an environment where physical evidence from decades of criminal investigations rested in careful preservation. Here, in rows of metal shelving units that stretched from floor to ceiling, the tangible remnants of criminal cases awaited periodic examination by investigators, reviewing cold cases or attorneys preparing for appeals. Fletcher's extended security responsibilities included monthly inspections of this evidence facility, where his flashlight beam would move methodically across labeled boxes and sealed containers that held fragments of stories documented in the case, files he knew so well from the archive building. The evidence facility represented the physical dimension of criminal investigation, where abstract reports and witness statements were anchored by concrete objects that had played roles in real crimes and investigations. The facility's organization reflected the same careful attention to detail that characterized the police archive, with evidence sorted by case number, date, and type of crime. Each item was secured in appropriate containers designed to prevent deterioration and contamination, with detailed chain of custody documentation that tracked every person who had handled the evidence since its collection. At crime scenes decades earlier, near the facility's entrance, a work area contained tables and equipment where investigators could examine evidence under controlled conditions, photographing items and taking measurements without compromising their integrity for potential future use in legal proceedings. The work area's bright lighting and sterile surfaces created an atmosphere more reminiscent of a laboratory than a traditional police facility. The oldest evidence occupied shelving units near the facility's rear wall, where items from cases dating back to the 1940s and 1950s rested in storage, containers that had been periodically updated to meet evolving preservation standards. These items represented some of the earliest examples of systematic evidence collection and preservation, showing how law enforcement had gradually developed more sophisticated approaches to physical evidence. Fletcher paused at a shelf containing evidence from a 1952 burglary case, examining labels that indicated the presence of fingerprint cards, photographs, and physical items that had been collected from the crime scene. The evidence had been stored according to the standards of its time, with some items showing the effects of decades of storage despite careful preservation efforts. The 1952 case had involved a series of commercial burglaries that had been solved through innovative fingerprint analysis, one of the early successes that had demonstrated the value of scientific approaches to criminal investigation. The physical evidence from this case had been retained not only for its potential legal value, but also as an example of investigative techniques that had laid the groundwork for contemporary forensic science. Adjacent shelving contained evidence from cases in the 1960s and 1970s, periods that had seen significant advances in forensic techniques and evidence preservation methods. These cases showed the gradual adoption of more sophisticated approaches to evidence collection and analysis, with improved photography, better preservation techniques, and more detailed documentation of crime scene conditions. One section contained evidence from Detective Morrison's cases, items that had been collected during his methodical investigations and preserved according to his exacting standards for evidence handling. Morrison's evidence showed the careful attention to detail that had characterized his work, with comprehensive documentation and preservation that had made his cases models for other investigators to follow. A box labeled with Morrison's handwriting contained evidence from the security company case that had occupied much of his final year before retirement. The box held documents, photographs, and physical items that had been crucial to proving the connection between the security company employee and the series of commercial robberies that had puzzled investigators for months. Security company evidence included floor plans that had been annotated to show alarm system locations, photographs of crime scenes that documented the criminals' methods, and documentation of the inside information that had made the robberies possible. The physical evidence provided concrete support for the complex investigative work that had eventually revealed the pattern connecting the crimes. Fletcher examined the careful labeling and documentation that accompanied Morrison's evidence, observing how each item had been cataloged with detailed descriptions of its significance to the overall case. Morrison's evidence handling had set standards that continued to influence contemporary practice, showing how thorough documentation could preserve the Value of physical evidence for future use at the drug cases from Detective Williams. Investigations occupied several shelving units containing substances, paraphernalia, and related items that had been collected during narcotics investigations. These items required special handling and storage due to their hazardous nature and the strict legal requirements that governed controlled substances used as evidence in criminal cases. Williams' drug evidence showed the evolution of illegal drug activity. Over the decades, she had specialized in narcotics investigation. Early cases involved relatively simple substances and distribution methods, while later evidence reflected the increasing sophistication of drug trafficking operations and the emergence of new synthetic drugs that had created additional challenges for law enforcement. One container held evidence from a major drug distribution case that had required coordination with federal agencies and had resulted in the seizure of substantial quantities of illegal substances. The evidence included not only drugs, but also financial records, communication devices, and other materials that had documented the structure and operations of the criminal organization. The drug evidence also included items that had been used for surveillance and undercover operations, specialized equipment that had allowed investigators to gather evidence about criminal activities without alerting suspects to the ongoing investigation. These items represented the sophisticated techniques that had been necessary to penetrate drug distribution networks effectively. Fletcher observed how drug evidence required periodic testing and analysis to maintain its legal validity, with laboratory reports and chain of custody records that documented every examination and analysis performed over the years since collection. The complexity of maintaining drug evidence reflected the serious legal requirements that governed these high-stakes criminal cases. The domestic violence cases, investigated by Detective Martinez, had generated evidence that required particularly sensitive handling, including photographs of injuries, damaged property, and personal items that documented the impact of violent behavior on victims and families. These items were stored with special attention to privacy and dignity considerations that recognized the traumatic nature of domestic violence. Martinez's domestic violence evidence included medical records, photographs, and personal statements that had been crucial to prosecuting cases where victims had been unable or unwilling to testify due to fear or emotional trauma. The physical evidence had provided alternative means of proving criminal activity when traditional witness testimony had been unavailable. One box contained evidence from a domestic violence case that had resulted in successful prosecution despite the victim's initial reluctance to cooperate with authorities. The evidence included photographs of injuries, damaged household items, and documentation of threatening communications that had established a pattern of abusive behavior over an extended period. The domestic violence evidence also included items that had been collected to document the impact of violence on children who had witnessed abusive behavior, recognizing that domestic violence affected entire families and required comprehensive documentation to support effective intervention and prosecution efforts. Fletcher noted how domestic violence evidence was organized with particular attention to victim safety and privacy, with access restrictions that protected sensitive information while ensuring that evidence remained available for legal proceedings and appeals. The storage protocols reflected law enforcement's recognition of the unique vulnerabilities faced by domestic violence victims. The white-collar crime evidence from Detective Thompson's investigations occupied a separate section where financial documents, computer equipment, and business records were stored under conditions that protected paper documents and electronic media from deterioration. These cases had generated substantial quantities of documentary evidence that required careful preservation and organization. Thompson's financial crime evidence included bank records, business documents, and computer files that had been essential to proving complex fraud schemes and embezzlement cases. The evidence showed how financial criminals had attempted to conceal their activities through sophisticated record-keeping, manipulations, and corporate structures designed to obscure illegal transactions. 1. Extensive collection contained evidence from the non-profit embezzlement case that had required months of financial analysis to uncover systematic theft of charitable donations. The evidence included original accounting records, computer files, and documentation of financial transactions that had revealed how small amounts had been diverted over extended periods to create substantial, cumulative theft. The white-collar crime evidence also included materials that had been collected during searches of suspects' offices and homes, items that had revealed the methods used to conceal illegal financial activities and the lifestyle enhancements that had been purchased with stolen funds. These items had helped establish criminal intent and demonstrate the impact of financial crimes on victims and organizations. Fletcher observed how financial crime evidence required specialized storage conditions to protect computer media and paper documents from environmental factors that could compromise their integrity. The evidence storage protocols had been adapted to accommodate the unique preservation requirements of different types of financial evidence. The cybercrime cases from Detective Park's pioneering work in computer-related criminal investigation had created new challenges for evidence preservation, with electronic devices and digital media requiring storage conditions and handling procedures that had not existed when the evidence facility had been originally designed. Park's cybercrime evidence included computer equipment, storage media, and printed copies of digital communications that had been essential to proving online fraud, hacking, and other technology-related crimes. The evidence showed how criminal activity had migrated into digital environments and how law enforcement had adapted to investigate crimes that existed primarily in electronic form. One collection contained evidence from an early internet fraud case that had required coordination with multiple technology companies and internet service providers to trace electronic communications and financial transactions across state and national boundaries. The evidence included computer files, email records, and documentation of online activities that had established the methods used to defraud victims. The cybercrime evidence also included specialized forensic tools and software that had been used to analyze computer systems and recover deleted files, representing the technological sophistication that had become necessary for effective investigation of computer-related crimes. These tools had evolved rapidly as both criminal methods and investigative techniques had become more sophisticated. Fletcher noted how cybercrime evidence required ongoing attention to technological obsolescence, with periodic transfer of data to newer storage media and conversion of files to formats that remained accessible as technology evolved. The evidence preservation challenges reflected the rapid pace of technological change that affected both criminal activity and law enforcement responses. The organized crime investigations, led by Detective Martinez, had generated evidence that remained highly sensitive years after the original cases had been concluded, with items that could potentially compromise ongoing investigations or endanger witnesses who had provided information to law enforcement authorities. Martinez's organized crime evidence included surveillance photographs, recorded communications, and financial records that had documented the structure and operations of criminal organizations. The evidence required special security measures and restricted access protocols that protected sensitive information while maintaining its availability for legitimate law enforcement purposes. 1. Secured collection contained evidence from a major organized crime investigation that had required years of patient surveillance and informant development to penetrate a criminal organization that had operated sophisticated illegal enterprises across multiple jurisdictions. The evidence had ultimately supported successful prosecutions that had significantly disrupted organized criminal activities in the region. The organized crime evidence also included materials that had been collected during coordinated raids and arrests, items that had revealed the scope and sophistication of criminal enterprises that had operated legitimate businesses as fronts for illegal activities. The evidence had shown how organized crime had adapted to modern business practices while maintaining traditional criminal methods. Fletcher observed how organized crime evidence required the highest levels of security and access control, with multiple authorization procedures and detailed logging of every examination or review performed by law enforcement personnel. The security protocols reflected the ongoing sensitivity of cases that often involved witness protection and continuing criminal investigations. The juvenile cases handled by Detective Rodriguez had generated evidence that required special handling due to legal protections for minors and the rehabilitation-focused approach that governed juvenile justice proceedings. The evidence was stored with particular attention to confidentiality requirements and the potential for expungement of juvenile records. Rodriguez's juvenile evidence included items that documented both criminal activities and the family and social circumstances that had contributed to young people's involvement in illegal behavior. The evidence reflected law enforcement's recognition that effective intervention with juvenile offenders required understanding of broader social and family dynamics. When collection contained evidence from successful juvenile intervention cases that had helped young people avoid further involvement in criminal activity, including documentation of educational and employment programs that had provided positive alternatives to criminal behavior. The evidence showed how appropriate intervention could redirect young lives in constructive directions. The juvenile evidence also included materials that had been collected to support coordination with schools, social service agencies, and family courts that had shared responsibility for addressing juvenile crime. The collaborative approach had generated additional documentation requirements, but had also improved outcomes for young offenders and their families. Fletcher noted how juvenile evidence was organized, with special attention to confidentiality and the possibility that records might eventually be sealed or expunged as part of successful rehabilitation efforts. The storage protocols reflected the different goals and legal requirements that governed juvenile justice proceedings. Cold case evidence occupied a special section where items from unsolved investigations awaited periodic review by investigators who hoped that advancing forensic techniques might eventually provide new leads or conclusive identification of suspects. These items represented the most persistent challenges in criminal investigation, cases where traditional methods had been exhausted, but hope remained for eventual resolution. Detective Walsh's cold case evidence included items that had been collected decades earlier and preserved despite the lack of immediate leads or suspects. The evidence showed how patient preservation efforts had occasionally paid off when new investigative techniques or database technologies had made it possible to re-examine old cases with fresh approaches. One collection contained evidence from a 1970s homicide case that had recently been reopened due to advances in DNA analysis technology, items that had been carefully preserved for decades, despite the absence of viable suspects. The case illustrated how evidence preservation could eventually contribute to justice even when initial investigations had been unsuccessful. The cold case evidence also included items that had been re-examined multiple times as new investigative techniques had become available, showing how persistent effort and advancing technology could eventually provide answers to questions that had remained unresolved for years or decades. Fletcher observed how cold case evidence required special attention to preservation standards, with periodic review and transfer to newer storage systems that maintained the integrity of items that might eventually provide crucial breakthroughs in unsolved investigations. The long-term preservation efforts reflected law enforcement's commitment to seeking justice even in the most challenging cases. As Fletcher completed his inspection of the evidence facility, he reflected on how these physical items provided tangible connections to the crimes documented in the case files he knew from the archive building. The evidence represented the concrete reality behind abstract reports and legal documents, offering physical proof of events that had affected real people and communities. The careful preservation of evidence over decades demonstrated law enforcement's commitment to maintaining the integrity of criminal investigations and ensuring that physical proof remained available for legal proceedings and appeals. The evidence facility represented a crucial component of the criminal justice system's efforts to base decisions on factual evidence rather than speculation or assumption. Fletcher's role as guardian of both case files and physical evidence connected him to the comprehensive effort to preserve the materials necessary for effective criminal investigation and prosecution. His security duties protected not only documents and objects, but also the institutional commitment to evidence-based law enforcement that served the community's need for justice and public safety. Relationship between case files and physical evidence illustrated the multifaceted nature of criminal investigation, where written documentation and physical proof work together to create comprehensive records of criminal activity and law enforcement responses. Both types of evidence served essential roles in the ongoing effort to maintain public safety and ensure justice for crime victims. Walking back through the quiet Croydon streets toward the police archive building, Fletcher carried with him a renewed appreciation for the thoroughness and dedication that characterized professional law enforcement. The evidence facility had provided concrete demonstration of the careful work that went into building criminal cases and preserving the materials necessary for effective prosecution and appeals. The physical evidence had humanized the abstract case files, providing tangible reminders that criminal investigations dealt with real events that had affected real people. The careful preservation of both documents and physical items reflected the institutional commitment to seeking truth and justice through systematic collection and analysis of factual evidence. Fletcher's nighttime observations connected him to this larger institutional purpose, making him a guardian of the comprehensive record-keeping and evidence preservation that supported effective criminal investigation and prosecution. His security duties ensured that the work of justice could continue, supported by secure facilities and protected evidence that preserved both the knowledge and physical proof necessary for fair and effective law enforcement. The final archive room occupied the building's top floor, a space reserved for cases that had reached their ultimate resolution through the careful processes of investigation, prosecution, and legal closure. Here, in the gentle light that filtered through frosted windows, the completed stories of criminal justice rested in perfect order, their documentation sealed and preserved as permanent records of how the community had addressed challenges to public safety and individual welfare. Fletcher's final rounds each night brought him to this quiet sanctuary where the work of decades found its peaceful conclusion. The cases stored here had moved through every stage of the criminal justice process, from initial investigation through courtroom proceedings to final sentencing and appeals. They represented the system working as designed, questions answered, justice served, and communities protected through the patient application of law and evidence. The archival silence of this top floor carried a different quality than the active quiet of investigation floors below. This was the silence of completion, of stories that had found their endings through the careful work of investigators, attorneys, judges, and juries who had brought criminal cases to their proper conclusions. The air itself seemed to hold the satisfaction of difficult work completed and justice served. Detective Morrison's career had culminated in this room, where his final cases rested in perfectly organized files that documented his methodical approach to criminal investigation and his unwavering commitment to seeking truth through careful analysis of evidence and patient development of facts. His cases had become models for other investigators, examples of how professional dedication and systematic methodology could bring even the most complex investigations to successful conclusions. The security company case that had occupied Morrison's final months of active service now rested in a file that documented every stage of the investigation, from the initial recognition of patterns through the careful development of evidence that had revealed the inside connection, enabling the series of commercial robberies. The case file showed how patient observation and systematic analysis had eventually revealed connections that were invisible when examining individual incidents in isolation. Morrison's documentation of the security company investigation had established new standards for pattern analysis and multi-jurisdictional coordination, approaches that had been adopted by other investigators facing similar complex cases. The successful conclusion of this investigation had validated Morrison's methodical approach and had provided valuable lessons for future cases involving inside information and criminal collaboration. The case resolution had resulted in successful prosecutions that had not only punished the individuals responsible for the crimes, but had also led to improved security practices throughout the private security industry. The investigation had revealed systemic vulnerabilities that had been addressed through new policies and procedures that had prevented similar crimes from occurring in other contexts. Fletcher paused at Morrison's completed files, appreciating how the veteran detective's final cases had achieved the kind of comprehensive resolution that represented the criminal justice system functioning at its best. The files documented not only successful investigations and prosecutions, but also the broader positive impact that had resulted from professional law enforcement work conducted according to the highest standards. Nearby, Detective Williams' narcotics investigations had reached their conclusions through successful dismantling of drug distribution networks that had threatened community safety and individual welfare. Her files documented the patient work of building cases against sophisticated criminal organizations, efforts that had ultimately resulted in substantial prison sentences for key participants and significant disruption of illegal drug trafficking in the region. The drug distribution case that had required months of surveillance and coordination with federal agencies now rested in a comprehensive file that showed how systematic investigation had gradually revealed the structure and operations of a complex criminal enterprise. The case had resulted in multiple arrests, substantial asset forfeitures, and the disruption of drug distribution networks that had been operating across state boundaries. The successful conclusion of Williams' major drug cases had not only resulted in criminal convictions, but had also contributed to broader policy discussions about drug enforcement strategies and treatment approaches for individuals affected by substance abuse. Her investigations had provided data that informed community-wide approaches to addressing drug-related crime and its underlying causes. Fletcher observed how Williams' completed files documented the evolution of her investigative techniques over her career, showing how she had adapted to changing criminal methods and had incorporated new technologies and approaches as they became available. Her cases represented a comprehensive record of professional development and institutional learning that continued to benefit contemporary investigations. Detective Martinez's domestic violence cases had achieved resolutions that emphasized both accountability for perpetrators and safety for victims, with comprehensive files that documented not only successful prosecutions, but also the coordination with support services that had helped families heal and rebuild after experiencing violence. Her cases showed how criminal justice could serve broader goals of community safety and individual welfare. The domestic violence case that had required extensive Coordination with victim advocates and social service agencies now rested in a file that documented the complex process of building prosecution cases while maintaining victim safety and supporting family recovery. The case had resulted in criminal convictions that had been accompanied by comprehensive safety planning and support service coordination. Martinez's documentation had established protocols for domestic violence investigation that had been adopted throughout the department, approaches that balanced the need for effective prosecution with recognition of the complex dynamics that affected domestic violence victims and their families. Her methods had improved outcomes for both individual cases and departmental responses to domestic violence generally. The resolution of Martinez's domestic violence cases had often included not only criminal sanctions, but also court-ordered counseling and intervention programs that had helped perpetrators address the underlying issues that had contributed to violent behavior. These comprehensive approaches had reduced recidivism and had contributed to long-term improvements in family safety and stability. Fletcher noted how Martinez's completed files documented successful interventions that had broken cycles of domestic violence and had helped families develop healthier relationship patterns. Her cases represented examples of how criminal justice could contribute to positive social change through comprehensive approaches that addressed both immediate safety concerns and underlying social problems. Detective Thompson's white-collar crime investigations had reached conclusions through successful prosecutions that had not only punished individual criminals, but had also led to policy changes and improved oversight procedures that had prevented similar crimes from occurring in other contexts. Her cases demonstrated how financial crime investigation could serve broader purposes of protecting economic systems and public trust. The nonprofit embezzlement case that had required months of financial analysis now rested in a file that documented the systematic process of uncovering hidden theft and building a prosecution case that had withstood sophisticated legal challenges. The case had resulted in criminal convictions, financial restitution for the affected organization, and improved financial oversight procedures throughout the nonprofit sector. Thompson's documentation had become a model for other financial crime investigators, showing how patient analysis of financial records and coordination with accounting experts could reveal complex fraud schemes that were designed to avoid detection through traditional audit procedures. Her methods had been incorporated into training programs for investigators throughout the region. The successful conclusion of Thompson's financial crime cases had often resulted in civil recovery, actions that had restored stolen funds to victims and organizations, demonstrating how criminal prosecution could be combined with civil remedies to provide comprehensive responses to financial crimes. These approaches had improved outcomes for victims while deterring future criminal activity. Fletcher observed how Thompson's completed files documented the evolution of financial crime investigation techniques, showing how investigators had developed expertise in complex business practices and had learned to coordinate with regulatory agencies and professional organizations that had specialized knowledge relevant to financial crime cases. Detective Park's pioneering work in cybercrime investigation had established precedents and procedures that had been adopted throughout the law enforcement community, with his completed cases serving as models for how to address criminal activity in digital environments. His files documented the early development of techniques and approaches that had become standard practice for cybercrime investigation. The internet fraud case that had required coordination with multiple technology companies now rested in a comprehensive file that showed how investigators had learned to navigate the technical and legal complexities of online criminal activity. The case had resulted in successful prosecutions that had been among the first to establish legal precedents for cybercrime enforcement. Park's documentation had become essential reference material for cybercrime investigators, providing practical guidance for evidence collection, technical analysis, and legal procedures that had been developed through trial and error during the early years of computer-related criminal investigation. His work had laid the foundation for contemporary cybercrime enforcement capabilities. Resolution of Park's cybercrime cases had often included not only criminal sanctions, but also civil actions and regulatory responses that had addressed the broader vulnerabilities that had made the criminal activity possible. These comprehensive approaches had contributed to improved cybersecurity practices throughout the business and technology communities. Fletcher noted how Park's completed files documented the rapid evolution of both criminal methods and investigative responses in the cybercrime field, showing how law enforcement had adapted to technological changes while maintaining effective capabilities for investigating and prosecuting computer-related crimes. Detective Chun's drug cases had achieved resolutions that emphasized both law enforcement and public health approaches to substance abuse problems, with files that documented how criminal prosecution had been combined with treatment referrals and community-based intervention programs to address the underlying issues that contributed to drug-related crime. The major drug distribution case that had required extensive surveillance and federal coordination now rested in a file that showed how systematic investigation had disrupted criminal organizations while also providing opportunities for individual participants to access treatment and rehabilitation services. The case had achieved both law enforcement and public health objectives through comprehensive intervention strategies. Chun's documentation had influenced departmental policies regarding drug enforcement, showing how traditional law enforcement approaches could be enhanced through coordination with treatment providers and social service agencies. Her methods had contributed to more effective responses to drug-related crime that addressed both criminal behavior and underlying substance abuse problems. Successful conclusion of Chun's drug cases had often included plea agreements that emphasized treatment and rehabilitation for lower-level participants, while ensuring appropriate punishment for criminal leaders and organizers. These approaches had improved outcomes for individuals while maintaining effective deterrence against drug trafficking activities. Fletcher observed how Chun's completed files documented the development of collaborative approaches to drug enforcement that had involved multiple agencies and community organizations working together to address both criminal activity and public health concerns related to substance abuse. Detective Rodriguez's gang-related investigations had reached conclusions that emphasized community safety while also addressing the social conditions that contributed to gang formation and criminal activity. Her files documented comprehensive approaches that had combined law enforcement action with community-based prevention and intervention programs. Asterisk. The gang violence case that had threatened community safety now rested in a file that showed how systematic investigation and community collaboration had reduced gang activity while also providing alternatives for young people who had been vulnerable to gang recruitment. The case had achieved both immediate safety improvements and long-term prevention goals. Rodriguez's documentation had established protocols for gang investigation that had been adopted by other jurisdictions, facing similar challenges, approaches that balanced aggressive enforcement against criminal activity with recognition of the social factors that contributed to gang involvement. Her methods had improved both law enforcement effectiveness and community relationships. The resolution of Rodriguez's gang cases had often included community-based programs that had provided education, employment, and recreational alternatives for young people in affected neighborhoods. These comprehensive approaches had reduced gang recruitment while improving community cohesion and resilience against criminal activity. Fletcher noted how Rodriguez's completed files documented successful examples of how law enforcement and community organizations could work together to address gang-related problems through approaches that combined enforcement, prevention, and community development strategies. The cold case resolutions represented some of the most satisfying conclusions in the archive. Cases where patient preservation of evidence and periodic review with new investigative techniques had eventually provided answers to questions that had remained unresolved for years or decades. These files documented the value of persistence and the importance of maintaining hope for justice even in the most challenging cases. Detective Welsh's cold case investigations had achieved breakthrough resolutions through advances in DNA analysis and database technology, with files that documented how systematic re-examination of old evidence had eventually provided conclusive identification of suspects in cases that had been dormant for years. These successes had validated the importance of comprehensive evidence preservation and periodic case review. 1970s homicide case that had been reopened due to technological advances now rested in a file that showed how new forensic capabilities had provided answers that had been impossible to obtain when the crime was originally investigated. The case had resulted in successful prosecution decades after the original crime had occurred, providing closure for families and communities that had been affected by unsolved violence. Welsh's cold case documentation had demonstrated the importance of maintaining institutional memory and preserving evidence according to the highest standards, showing how materials that seemed to have no immediate value could eventually provide crucial breakthroughs when examined with improved techniques and technologies. Fletcher observed how the cold case resolutions represented justice delayed but not denied, showing how the criminal justice system's commitment to seeking truth could eventually provide answers and accountability even in the most challenging circumstances. These cases provided hope and validation for families and communities affected by unsolved crimes. As Fletcher completed his final rounds through the archive's top floor, he reflected on the profound satisfaction that characterized the space where difficult work had found its proper conclusion. The completed case files represented the criminal justice system functioning as intended, with professional investigation, fair legal proceedings, and appropriate resolution serving the community's needs for safety and justice. The archive's top floor existed as a sanctuary of completed purpose, where the questions that had driven investigations had found their answers and the communities affected by criminal activity had received the protection and justice they deserved. The careful preservation of these completed cases ensured that the lessons learned and precedents established would remain available to guide future investigations and inform ongoing professional development. Fletcher's role as guardian of this institutional memory connected him to the larger purpose that animated all the work documented in these files. His nightly rounds protected not only documents and evidence, but also the accumulated wisdom and professional dedication that these materials represented, ensuring that the community's investment in professional law enforcement would continue to serve future generations. The gentle silence of the archive's top floor provided space for reflection on the serious responsibilities that law enforcement professionals accepted when they committed themselves to serving their communities through the patient work of investigation, prosecution, and the pursuit of justice. The completed case files provided evidence that these responsibilities could be fulfilled effectively through professional dedication and institutional commitment to the highest standards of service. As dawn approached and Fletcher prepared to conclude his nightly vigil, the archive building settled into its daytime quiet, ready to support another day of professional service to the community's needs for safety and justice. The accumulated knowledge and evidence preserved within its walls would continue to serve the ongoing work of law enforcement, providing foundation and guidance for contemporary investigators who carried forward the tradition of professional service that these files represented. The night carried whispers that no one dared to repeat out loud, yet the streets remembered everything, and in the careful preservation of case files and evidence, the community's commitment to truth and justice found its permanent expression, ensuring that the work of seeking safety and accountability would continue through the patient dedication of those who served the cause of law and order in all its quiet complexity. The morning shift brought a different rhythm to the archive building as researchers, investigators, and administrative staff began their daily work among the files that Fletcher had guarded through the quiet hours of night. The building's daytime energy created a gentle counterpoint to the contemplative silence that characterized Fletcher's nocturnal rounds, with soft footsteps and muted conversations adding life to spaces that had rested in peaceful quiet just hours before Dr. Sarah Chun arrived each morning at precisely 8 o'clock, her academic credentials and research permissions granting her access to historical case files that she studied for her ongoing work on the evolution of criminal investigation techniques. Her research focused on how law enforcement practices had developed over the decades, using the archives' comprehensive collection to trace the gradual sophistication of investigative methods and the adoption of scientific approaches to criminal cases. Fletcher often observed Dr. Chun's arrival during his final security rounds, noting how she moved through the building with the careful reverence of someone who understood the significance of the materials housed within these walls. Her research work represented another dimension of the archive's service to the community, preserving not only the records of individual cases but also the broader institutional knowledge that could inform future law enforcement practices and professional development. Dr. Chun's CURRENT research project examined how domestic violence investigation had evolved from the 1950s through the present day, tracing changes in legal approaches, investigative techniques, and community resources that had gradually improved outcomes for victims and families affected by domestic violence. Her work required careful examination of case files from different decades to identify patterns and developments that might not be apparent when examining individual cases in isolation. The basement archive provided Dr. Chun with access to the oldest domestic violence files, cases from the 1950s and 1960s that reflected the limited legal options and social understanding available to law enforcement during that period. These early files often documented situations where police officers had few alternatives beyond attempting to mediate family disputes, with criminal prosecution rarely pursued due to legal barriers and social attitudes that treated domestic violence as a private family matter. Reading through the basement files, Dr. Chun could trace the gradual recognition that domestic violence was a serious crime that required professional law enforcement response rather than informal mediation or family-based solutions. The evolution visible in these files reflected broader social changes in understanding of family dynamics, individual rights, and the appropriate role of law enforcement in protecting vulnerable community members. The first floor archives contained domestic violence cases from the 1970s and 1980s, periods that had seen significant legal and social developments in addressing family violence. These files showed how law enforcement had begun developing specialized approaches to domestic violence investigation, with improved training for officers and better coordination with social service agencies and victim advocacy organizations. Dr. Chun's analysis of first-floor files revealed how domestic violence investigation had gradually incorporated understanding of trauma psychology, family dynamics, and the complex factors that affected victims' willingness and ability to cooperate with criminal prosecution efforts. The files showed how investigators had learned to build cases that could proceed, even when victims were unable or unwilling to testify, using physical evidence, witness statements, and documentation of patterns of abuse to support prosecution efforts. The second-floor files provided Dr. Chun with examples of contemporary domestic violence investigation, showing how current practices had incorporated decades of professional development and social learning. These recent cases demonstrated sophisticated approaches that balanced criminal prosecution with comprehensive safety planning in coordination with support services that addressed both immediate protection needs and long-term recovery and healing processes. Fletcher had observed Dr. Chun's research methods during his security rounds, noting how she carefully photographed relevant documents and maintained detailed notes about patterns and developments she identified in the files. Her systematic approach to historical analysis reflected the same kind of methodical thoroughness that characterized the investigative work documented in the files she studied. Dr. Chen's research had already produced several academic papers that had been published in criminal justice journals, contributing to professional knowledge about effective approaches to domestic violence investigation and informing training programs for law enforcement officers throughout the region. Her work represented another way that the archive served the broader community by supporting research that could improve future law enforcement practices. The archive's daytime visitors also included attorneys who needed access to historical case files for appeals, post-conviction proceedings, or civil litigation related to criminal cases. These legal professionals brought a different perspective to the files, examining them not for historical or academic insights, but for specific information that could affect ongoing legal proceedings or client representation needs. Attorney Michael Rodriguez regularly visited the archive to research cases that had potential implications for his appellate practice, particularly older cases where legal precedents or investigative procedures might be relevant to contemporary appeals. His work required careful examination of trial records, evidence handling procedures, and investigative methods that had been used in historical cases that shared characteristics with his current cases. Rodriguez's research often focused on cases from the 1970s and 1980s, periods when certain investigative techniques and legal procedures were being developed that might not have met contemporary standards for evidence handling or constitutional protections. His analysis of these historical cases sometimes identified issues that could provide grounds for appeals or post-conviction relief for clients who had been convicted using methods that were acceptable at the time but would not meet current legal standards. Fletcher had observed Rodriguez's meticulous approach to examining case files, noting how the attorney paid particular attention to documentation of evidence collection, chain of custody procedures, and investigative methods that might be subject to legal challenge under contemporary legal standards. Rodriguez's work represented the ongoing legal scrutiny that ensured criminal convictions were based on proper procedures and constitutional protections. The archive also served social work professionals who needed historical information about families and individuals involved in criminal cases, particularly for situations where current social service interventions required understanding of past involvement with law enforcement or criminal justice systems. These professionals brought expertise in family dynamics and social services that provided different insights into the human stories documented in criminal case files. Social worker Jennifer Martinez frequently consulted archive files when working with families where parents or children had previous involvement with criminal justice systems, using historical information to understand patterns of behavior and develop appropriate intervention strategies. Her work required sensitive handling of confidential information and careful attention to privacy protections that governed access to criminal case files. Martinez's use of archive files often focused on juvenile cases and family-related criminal matters, situations where understanding of past involvement with law enforcement could inform current decisions about child welfare, family services, and community-based interventions. Her professional expertise helped identify social factors and family dynamics that might not be apparent to individuals without specialized training in social work practice. Fletcher had observed how Martinez approached archive files with particular sensitivity to the human impact documented in criminal cases, recognizing that behind every case file were real people whose lives had been affected by criminal activity and law enforcement intervention. Her work represented the archive's contribution to ongoing social service efforts that helped families and individuals address problems and build healthier community relationships. The archive's academic users included graduate students conducting dissertation research on various aspects of criminal justice, history, and practice. These young scholars brought fresh perspectives and research questions to the archive's holdings, often identifying patterns and connections that had not been previously recognized by law enforcement professionals or other researchers. Graduate student David Park was completing his dissertation on the evolution of gang enforcement strategies, using the archive's gang-related case files to trace how law enforcement approaches had developed in response to changing gang activities and community conditions. His research required examination of files spanning several decades to identify long-term trends and assess the effectiveness of different enforcement approaches. Park's research had revealed interesting patterns in gang activity and law enforcement response, showing how both criminal methods and investigative techniques had evolved through ongoing adaptation and learning processes. His academic perspective provided insights that complemented the practical knowledge of law enforcement professionals who had worked directly with gang-related cases. Fletcher appreciated the careful attention that graduate students like Park brought to archive files, noting how their research questions often led to new insights about the materials housed in the building. The academic use of the archive ensured that the institutional knowledge preserved in case files continued to contribute to broader understanding of criminal justice issues and professional practice. The building's daytime atmosphere included the quiet work of archive staff who maintained the filing systems, processed new additions to the collection, and assisted visitors with locating specific files or information. These professional archivists ensured that the collection remained organized and accessible while protecting the integrity of historical documents and maintaining appropriate security and confidentiality protections. Archive supervisor Robert Thompson oversaw the daily operations that kept the facility functioning effectively, managing staff assignments, processing access requests, and maintaining the environmental controls that protected paper documents from deterioration. His professional expertise in archival science ensured that the collection met professional standards for historical preservation while remaining accessible for legitimate research and legal purposes. Thompson's work included periodic review of filing systems and storage procedures to ensure that materials remained properly organized and accessible as the collection continued to grow with new cases and historical materials. His attention to professional archival practices ensured that the archive could serve current and future users while protecting the integrity of irreplaceable historical documents. Fletcher had developed considerable respect for Thompson and the archive staff, observing how their professional dedication ensured that his nighttime security duties protected facilities that were maintained according to the highest professional standards. The collaboration between security and archival professionals created comprehensive protection for the valuable materials housed in the building. The archive's role in training new law enforcement officers included regular visits from police academy classes and continuing education programs that used historical case files to illustrate investigative techniques and professional practices. These educational uses of the archive ensured that lessons learned from past cases continued to inform contemporary law enforcement training and professional development. Training coordinator Lisa Williams regularly brought groups of new officers through the archive, using specific case files to demonstrate how patient investigation and careful documentation had led to successful case resolution. These training sessions provided practical examples that complemented classroom instruction and helped new officers understand the importance of thorough case preparation and evidence handling. Williams' training programs often focused on case files that illustrated common investigative challenges and showed how professional approaches had overcome initial obstacles to achieve successful outcomes. The real-world examples provided by archive cases offered valuable learning opportunities that helped new officers develop effective investigative skills and professional judgment. Fletcher had observed these training sessions during daytime hours when his security duties overlapped with regular business operations, noting how the archive's historical cases provided compelling examples of professional law enforcement work. The educational use of archive materials ensured that institutional knowledge continued to influence current practices and professional development. The building's afternoon quiet provided opportunities for contemplative research and detailed analysis. As morning visitors completed their work and the archive settled into the peaceful atmosphere that Fletcher knew from his nighttime rounds. The transition from morning activity to afternoon calm marked the daily rhythm that characterized the building's service to various research and professional communities. Dr. Chun often remained in the archive through the afternoon hours, taking advantage of the quiet environment to conduct detailed analysis of the files she had identified during morning research sessions. Her sustained attention to historical patterns required the kind of focused concentration that was best supported by the archive's peaceful atmosphere during less busy periods. The afternoon hours also provided opportunities for archive staff to conduct maintenance and organizational tasks that required undisturbed access to filing areas and storage systems. These behind-the-scenes activities ensured that the collection remained properly maintained and accessible while minimizing disruption to researchers and other visitors who needed to use archive materials. Fletcher's overlap between night security duties and daytime operations gave him unique insight into the full range of activities that the archive supported, from academic research to legal work to law enforcement training. His observations of both nighttime quiet and daytime activity provided comprehensive understanding of the building's role in serving various community needs related to criminal justice and public safety. As evening approached and daytime visitors completed their work, the archive began its transition back to the contemplative quiet that characterized Fletcher's nighttime guardianship. The building's daily cycle of activity and rest created a rhythm that honored both the active use of archived materials and the peaceful preservation that protected these valuable resources for future generations. The lengthening shadows that preceded Fletcher's evening shift reminded him of the continuous cycle that connected past investigations to current research, historical cases to contemporary training, and the accumulated wisdom of decades to the ongoing work of serving community safety and justice. The archive existed as a bridge between past and present, preserving institutional memory while supporting current and future professional development. Fletcher's transition from daytime observer to nighttime guardian marked his renewed commitment to protecting the comprehensive collection of materials that served so many important purposes in the community's ongoing efforts to maintain safety and justice. His security duties ensured that the valuable work conducted during daytime hours remained protected and accessible for continued service to researchers, legal professionals, educators, and law enforcement officers who relied on the archive's resources. The evening quiet that settled over the archive building created space for reflection on the various ways that historical case files continued to serve contemporary needs, providing examples, precedents, insights, and inspiration for ongoing work in criminal justice and public safety. Fletcher's role as guardian of this institutional treasure connected him to all these purposes, making him a protector not only of documents and evidence, but also of the continuing service that these materials provided to the community. As night fell and the building prepared for another cycle of peaceful preservation, Fletcher began his security rounds with renewed appreciation for the archive's multiple roles in serving justice, education, research, and professional development. The quiet hours ahead would provide time for contemplation of the serious responsibilities that connected historical preservation to contemporary service and individual dedication to community welfare.